時間になりましたので、これより次世代競争パートナーシップ文化の輪 2.0 ネットワーキングイベント2025日本研究フェローカンファレンス未来を開く力対話の空間としての日本学を始めます。私、本日の進行係を務めます国際交流基金の北村と申します。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。まず最初に皆様にご注意いただきたい事項を簡単にお伝えします。本講義室内では飲食禁止となっております。貴重品については参加者ご自身で保管管理くださいますようお願いします。あらかじめご案内させていただいたとおり、本日は動画及び写真の撮影を行います。撮影物は国際交流基金や東北大学の広報などで利用させていただくことがありますので、あらかじめご了承ください。なお、集合写真は午前のセッションの後に撮影します。お手元の資料の中にアンケートのお願いとアンケートフォームの QR コードを挟んでおります。ご回答いただけますようよろしくお願いいたします。それでは開会に際しまして国際交流基金参与の佐藤由里より皆様にご挨拶申し上げます。お願いします。
東北大学の先生方、学生の皆様、国際交流基金 JF フェローの皆様、おはようございます。本日は JF-CIJS 日本研究フェローカンファレンス2025にようこそおいでくださいました。国際交流基金は1972年の設立以来、毎年数多くの日本研究者を海外から招聘してきております。近年では年に1、2回程度、国内の大学や研究機関とともに共催でですね、フェローカンファレンスを開催しております。その中でも本日のカンファレンスは、私たち国際交流基金にとって2つの意味で大きな意味があると考えております。1つ目の意味は、ここ東北大学統合日本学センター CIJS とパートナーシップを結んで、さまざまなご縁が深まる中で、本日初めてこの CIJS と共催でフェローカンファレンスを開催するという点であります。国際交流基金は昨年、この東北大学の CIJS とヨーロッパ日本研究協会 EAJS との3者連携にて、博士課程の大学院生を対象にした JF-CIJS-EAJS フェローシップを立ち上げました。すでに現在ヨーロッパから2名の博士課程のこのフェローがですね、このプログラムで来日されて、東北大学での研究をスタートされています。今、来年度のこの募集をしておりますので、ぜひ若手の多くの研究者の方から応募があることを期待をしております。またつい2ヶ月前には、ここ東北大学でヨーロッパ日本研究協会 EAJS による第4回日本会議が開催されました。私自身も2日間にわたってこの会議に参加いたしました。ヨーロッパや日本、そして世界各地からですね、数多くの日本研究者がここに集って、直接に顔を合わせて議論を交わして大変充実した時間を過ごしました。日本で開催される EAJS というのは2018年以降ですね、コロナ禍を挟んでかなり久しぶりでしたので、皆さん直接会える喜びもひとしおという空気でありました。そして本日のカンファレンスの2つ目の意義ですけれども、テーマタイトルにある対話、ダイアログという点であります。フェローの皆様はさまざまな世界中の国、地域から、博士課程の皆さんからベテランの研究者まで、年齢も立場も専門も研究分野も非常にさまざまな方々が今集まっておられます。フェローとして日本に滞在する期間とか、そして場所もさまざまです。こうした多様性に富んだフェローの皆さんがここに一堂に会われるこの本日のカンファレンスでは、国際交流基金フェローとして日本に来たからこそ経験できる対話をぜひ味わっていただきたいと私ども考えまして、 基調講演ではシンガポール国立大学のタン・レンレン先生から東南アジアの視点から対話をテーマにしたお話をいただきます。続いてパネルディスカッション、ポスター発表、ディスカッションと多彩な対話ができるプログラムを用意しました。ぜひ日本を共通項として本日この場に集まった者同士、とりわけ専門や研究分野の異なる方々とも積極的に対話をしてですね、新たな視点やつながりを発見して帰っていただければと願っております。私たち国際交流基金は日本研究を単に日本を深く知って掘り下げていくだけのものとは考えておりません。日本研究を通じて比較の視点を育み、社会や文化などさまざまな広いテーマを考え、世界のさまざまな共通課題に関わっていく可能性というのがあるものだと考えておりまして、それが将来的には国境や分野を超えた対話や協力につながっていくと考えております。私たちはこれからも世界中の研究者、研究機関をつなげて、そのネットワークを支援していきたいと考えておりまして、日本研究が真にグローバルで包摂的な学問として発展していくことを願っております。本日この場にいるフェローの皆さん、そして東北大学の先生方や学生の皆さんもぜひ同じ目標、つまりグローバルで包摂的な学問の発展という目標の仲間になっていただけたらと願っております。最後になりますが、本日の開催に至るまでのご準備では、足立センター長をはじめとして東北大学 CIJS の皆様方には大変お世話になりました。改めて感謝を申し上げますとともに、本日の皆さんとの会話交流を私自身大変楽しみにしております。それでは皆さん一日、明日もですね、楽しい充実した時をお過ごしください。ありがとうございます。
佐藤さんよ、ありがとうございました。続きまして、東北大学統合日本学センターの足立弘明センター長よりご挨拶をいただきます。
ようこそ仙台に、ようこそ東北に。東北大学統合日本学センターのセンター長をしております足立です。よろしくお願いいたします。ここ仙台、東北でこのフェローカンファレンスを開催できることを大変嬉しく思っております。国際交流基金の皆様のご尽力によってこうしたカンファレンスができることに心から感謝申し上げます。ようこそということを最初に強調しましたのは、東京や京都以外で、開催されるフェローカンファレンスとしては、この仙台が初めてということになるからです。で、その東京や京都と言われるような、日本の中の中心でない場所で、このフェローカンファレンスが開催されることは、とても意義があることだと考えております。東北地方は、古代から近代に至るまで、日本の中央政権に終焉とされてきました。特に私が研究している日本近現代史においては、東北はお米を中心とする日本全体の食料生産地として工業化されず、貧しい農村地帯として厳しい生活を人々は送ることを余儀なくされてきました。そうした周辺と呼ばれる東北地方から日本を見るということは、日本研究を行う上で重要なことではないかと思っております。この地に立つことによって、ぜひ日本をより広い、より全体的に俯瞰的な視点から捉える機会にしていってほしいというふうに思っております。今回、この カンファレンスをですね、国際交流基金様と一緒に主催する統合日本学センターについてご紹介させていただきたいと思います。統合日本学センターは、名前の通りですね、統合という言葉がありますが、国内外の日本研究の手法を統合する、データ駆動型研究と日本学とを統合するという、2つの目的を持っております。この2つの統合によって、日本学の新しい研究方法を生み出し、そのことによって世界における日本学の意義を高めるとともに、人類の豊かな未来を創造することに貢献する学問へと発展させることを考えております。そのために国内外の日本研究者とのですね、共同研究を極めて重視しております。現在、9つの共同研究プロジェクトが動いておりますが、詳細については、当センターのホームページをご覧になっていただきたいんですが、現在、9つのですね、共同研究プロジェクトが動いておりますが、このプロジェクトの数は、だんだんと増えていきます。希望ではさらに倍ぐらいまでですね、伸ばしたいというふうに思っておりますが、ですので、ぜひ、この研究プロジェクトにですね、皆さんも加わってほしいというふうに思っております。この統合日本学センターにぜひつながっていっていただきたいというふうに考えています。また、統合日本学センターは研究機関ではありますが、日本学国際共同大学院というですね、日本学を国際的に展開できる人材を育成するプログラム大学院と連携をしております。今回のフェローカンファレンスには、その大学院生、東北大学の大学院の院生も参加しており、ポスターセッションなどで発表する予定です。ぜひ日本の大学院生ともこの会議で交流を深めて、参加者一人一人の皆さんの日本研究のネットワークを広げていただきたいというふうに考えております。今回のカンファレンスのテーマは、未来を開く力、対話の空間としての日本学ということです。で、このコンセプトは、現在の国際社会が直面する複雑な問題に対して、日本研究から得られる知見や視点はどのように貢献していくのか、することができるのか、日本研究の成果を現代のグローバルな課題に対峙し、未来を切り開いていく道しるべとして発信していく。そのために多様な国や地域から集まった幅広い分野の次世代の日本研究者の方々が、不断の対話を通じて、現代の課題に貢献するプラットフォームとしての日本学の可能性を議論するというものであります。まさに私たち統合日本学センターのミッションに沿うものでございます。用意されました会議のプログラムを通じて、皆様の研究と交流が発展し、日本学が現代社会の未来を切り開いていくことにつながれば幸いだと考えております。最後になりましたが、先ほど佐藤参与様からもお話がありました国際交流基金と統合日本学センター、そしてヨーロッパ日本研究協会 EAJS の3社によるフェローシッププログラムの宣伝をさせていただきたいと思います。皆様のプログラムの中にすでにこういったフェローシップのですね、チラシが入っていると思いますが、現在、募集をしております。このような期間において、フェローシップをですね、募集しているのは3箇所ございますけれども、私どもの機関は、PhD キャンディデートを対象にしております。 そういう意味での特色があるかと思いますが、採用人数は若干名ですが、大体3名ぐらいをですね、予定しておりますので、ぜひですね、指導している大学院生の方や、お知り合いの研究者の指導している大学院生、お知り合いの大学院生の方々に情報を提供していただいて、ふるってご応募していただければというふうに思っております。募集期間は11月の21日までとなっておりますので、ぜひですね、ご応募いただけるようにお勧めいただけたらというふうに思っております。今日は皆様にこの十分なですね、おもてなしができるかちょっと不安なところがございますけれども、ゆっくり楽しんで、そして、また明日もですね、松島に行かれるということなので、東北をですね、堪能していただければというふうに思っております。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。ありがとうございました。
足立センター長、ありがとうございました。続きまして、シンガポール国立大学准教授、タン・レンレン先生に基調講演をお願いいたします。先生はイリノイ大学アーバナ・シャンペーン校で博士号を取得され、アジアの高齢化や世代間交流など、さまざまな分野についてご研究されています。本日の基調報告のタイトルは、対話の場としての日本研究、東南アジアからの視点、Japanese Studies as Space for Dialogue, Cases from Southeast Asia です。
Hello, good morning. おはようございます。Thank you so much for inviting me to this very special networking event. I used to be a dissertation fellow many decades ago. I think I was with Waseda University in Tokyo, and I really enjoyed, the time here to be able to have this opportunity to do research, in such a focus in Japan, and I'm sure all of you are feeling the same. I hope to have this opportunity to learn more about your work as well, and also for you to learn more about Southeast Asia and my university, National University of Singapore. Okay, so my presentation today focuses on Southeast Asia in exploring Japanese studies as a space for dialogue. As Adachi Sensei has said, this is, by itself a space for dialogue, and important as we develop new ideas and exchanges with each other, and to reflect on our role as Japanese studies scholars in the current time and in the future. Okay. Of course, I have to say that this idea of, this concept of space for dialogue is not new. I mean, we have been doing that over the recent decades. So, I want to start with this table that is taken from sociologist Yoshio Sugimoto in his 4th edition of Introduction to Japanese Society. I think quite a basic textbook for Japanese society classes. And where do you think we can position this Japanese studies as a space for dialogue? Okay, I think he has, this talking about the evolvement of Japanese studies here. So the last one, what he termed as a contemporary paradigm, which essentially referring to Japan opening up, becoming a platform for networking, collaboration, co-production, and coexistence because of acceptance with plural voices as it changed from being the sole point of study in the earlier phases to engagements and exchange. So there's, he talks about multiculturalism and so forth as well. But that was until 2000s, right? So I think moving on, maybe there should be a new phase of networking and this more global outlook of Japan. So, in fact, when this book came out, the 4th edition came out in 2014, Sugimoto-san doesn't know anything about Japanese studies in Southeast Asia. So when they organized a conference later on in 2015, that was when they invited me and I talked about Japanese studies in Southeast Asia, in which to them it was, to him especially, it was like a new thing, which I think would probably change his table a little bit, because his table was really a lot more from the Western perspective. So, so from the conference that's on about Eurocentrism and polycentrism, a book volume came about, adding to this existing discourse, with the call for moving beyond Eurocentrism to polycentrism. So this conference recognized the coexistence of different centers of Japanese studies, and also started to have more opportunities for collaborations as well as a result of the conference. And I brought this out here because we need to recognize that when we see a changing of paradigm, which we are all in the midst of it, it requires really opportunities for conversations and dialogues to slowly envision the different future. So since I'm on this topic of Eurocentrism, let me also introduce a couple more conceptual frameworks that confronts Eurocentrism. So this one is on, I think AJS method is not unfamiliar to many of us here, emphasizing the inter-referencing within Asia. Nowadays, we quite often use Kwang Shin Chen's idea from the field of intercultural Asian studies to discuss about Asia as method, as what he said, multiplying frames of reference in our subjectivity and worldview. That Asia has our own unique histories and cultures, but at the same time also acknowledging the West as constitutive of Asian subjectivity. But it's important to also remember that this whole Asia as method discourse was that Chen talks about was inspired by Takeuchi Yoshimi, who critiqued the binary framework of East and West long time ago, back in 1960. And at that time, he was already calling for interreferencing of Asia, confronting Eurocentrism with the method he referred to as AJS method. Although at that time, I think it was a very initial idea that he threw out, and he probably didn't really have much more conceptual, ideas about it. But I think it also, when we reflect back, what do we do today towards the conversations, in our sharing, in the dialogue, and in the platform, is going to maybe play a role in the shaping of what Japanese studies is going to be in the future. So with this Asia as method, Koichi Iwabuchi, who is a well-known cultural studies scholar, has proposed Trans-Asia as method in analyzing inter-Asia flows of media, culture, and people. So he talks about inter-Asia connectivity in a more concrete sense. Okay, so, and we also have to recognize that when we talk about, these different countries and engagements, for example, Southeast Asia and Japan, there are also some undercurrents of unequal power relations that should be acknowledged. And quite often you see that surfacing in our scholarship as well, talking about past histories, memories, and colonial experiences, and so forth. Okay, so next one, I cannot see whether I think it's up there. Japan +1 model is another developing conceptual model that I like to just introduce here. This model was surfaced by Stevens, that should be correct, right? By Stevens, Carolyn Stevens, in the 2015 conference in Melbourne, the one on Eurocentrism and polycentrism. So as what she says here, if there is a crisis in Japanese studies, it is that many believe it is no longer sufficient to investigate a single nation state as a unit of analysis. So she talks about a Japan Plus model as relevance for us to contextualize Japanese studies in wider cultural context. And the same, perhaps, like when someone started to boil, the idea of a new concept. She says here that plus, what can that be, will be, and from what perspective it is taken. And this is influenced by positionality of the researcher. So we can think of, from the Southeast Asian perspective, then we think of the Japan. When we talk about studying Japan, we also talk about its relationship of Japan with Southeast Asia. And how does that plus model help us to better understand both Japan and Southeast Asia as well? Okay, so let me move on to look at the Southeast Asia. How many of you are from Southeast Asia? Oh, great. I know, I saw the list, and there are quite a few of you from Thailand as well, right? So Southeast Asia here, when we talk about Southeast Asia, we always refer to ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which started with having 5 original countries: Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand. And then now it has 11 as of last month, because one more country joined in, Timor-Leste. Yeah, so if we look at Southeast Asia countries, it's not far from each other, but it's really very much characterized by diversity in many ways. Language is one. So a lot of the Japanese studies lessons are taught in native languages in these countries, except for Philippines and Singapore, we use English. Then there's also diversity in culture, history. The stages of modernization is different, and that also have an implications on there's differences, stages in development of Japanese studies. And apart from among the countries, the diversity, there's also diversity within the country as well, with some countries having also a wide number of some numbers of minority. Okay, so let me just show you the some of the developments here. Okay, so for example, you can see that like Japanese language education, in fact, started to take off first before the Japanese studies started, and it ranges from 1960s all the way to like 2000s for some of the other countries. Then this is Japanese studies program in Philippines, for example, started from 1966. And in Singapore, ours started in 1981. So those that started in 1980s, 1990s, a lot of it relates to the learn from Japan kind of model, because in the late 1970s, there was the world was crazy over Japan as an economic miracle. And in Singapore, that's a small country developing, we were very, very interested on how we can learn from Japan as well. And this is probably the kind of attitude that a lot of the Southeast Asian countries have. For example, Malaysia had a learn from look east policy. In that case, that also started for them to have much of an interest in sending Malaysia students to Japan and to study in Japan. Okay. So that's also Thailand and Vietnam. So basically you see that during this period in the 1990s, 80s, late 80s, 90s, what's happening in Europe? Or what's happening in the West in terms of Japanese studies? There's a crisis in Japanese studies and area studies, right, from the area studies paradigm. So there's a crisis because there's so much more after the Cold War, and there's so much more emphasis on global studies, to the point that people started, wondering whether it's necessary to study the area studies. So, but the situation is quite different in Southeast Asia. Programs in Japanese studies are still developing, are still opening new programs. Yeah, and of course, I know a lot of it are also because of the kind support of Japan Foundation as well in making this possible. So if you look at the characteristics of Japanese studies, so as I said, diversity in stages, in development among countries. As we see, some developing Japanese studies, Japanese languages, some are starting with Japanese studies and so forth. So they are less affected by area studies crisis. And also they receive support, pivotal support from Japan Foundation. And these programs also tend to focus on humanities, on linguistics, on history, at least in the initial programs in higher education. And as I said, summarized, is also a motivation to learn from Japan for many of these countries, and some of the studies also talk about power imbalances between Japan and Southeast Asian country. Okay, so moving on, I think we also need to recognize that when we talk about Japanese studies in Southeast Asia, we also look a lot into, as I said earlier, how Japan or how Singapore or how a Southeast Asian country engages with Japan. Okay, so this is one example where in Singapore, this is a course that I taught on Singapore and Japan, historic and contemporary relations, that we focus a lot on how Japan and Singapore, how that relations have developed over the years from pre-war time until present day. And in Singapore, if you have a chance to visit Singapore and want to know something about the relationship, Singapore did have a pre-war Japanese community in the pre-war. And you can see that from the Japanese cemetery that is still around in Singapore. It has now developed into a cemetery park. So people go there for jogging and all those as well. But it's really a living history. And I always like to bring students there to really imagine and understand more about the presence of Japanese at the turn of the century. Okay, and then other kinds of so we do have research. We do have people who research about the tombstones and all that. Yeah, there are, I think, 900 tombstones in this cemetery. And there are also expanding Japan Southeast Asia research that we can see over the years from the scholarship of Japanese studies scholars in Southeast Asia. I just put in the 3 focus here. I mean, there are a lot, but because I'm anthropologist by training, and I'm also more looking into contemporary society, so I tend to look more into contemporary times, but there are also people, quite a big group that's doing on humanities as well. So in these 3 examples here, Japanese occupation during World War II is something that has been well studied, and in the scholarship that I mean, there are a lot in Japanese language, but in English language, I think quite a lot came from Philippines. There are quite a lot of studies on Philippines on different aspects of the World War, so including even comics, the World War time comics and so forth, and how it tells us about the relationship and experiences of both Japanese and the Filipinos. Okay, and then the second topic, I think everybody is very, in all the Japanese Studies Center, one of the things that we have to do in the 2000s is really to start opening a lot of courses relating to pop culture, because that's where the interests of our young students lie. So Japanese popular culture in Southeast Asia has been quite well received, and a lot of our graduate students are also doing research in this area. So, for example, in my university, we have students doing, studying otaku in Japan, studying about pop culture idols. And I also had a research looking at cosplay in Singapore, which I became interested because of students' presentations in class. So I think when we look at popular culture research, a lot of them actually has been student-led and initiated with student interest. Some of our students also have they have their own fan identity, right? And that also led them to have more interest in research on Japanese pop culture. We also have a student who did a PhD Indonesian student looking at yaoi content consumption as act of resistance and space. So by the way, next year, in end of May, NUS is going to host a macadamia conference on popular culture. And I think the conference theme is now fixed as Traversing Trans-Asian Imaginaries, Anime, Manga, and Media Cultures. I think that's yet another space for dialogue in a more particular disciplined and cross-discipline areas. Okay, so Japan-Southeast Asia intimacies. Okay, I use the word intimacies to refer to the cross border of marriages, Japan and Southeast Asian marriages. For example, in Philippines, there used to be a lot of entertainments coming to Japan, and then maybe some of them got married to Japanese and so forth. So there's also quite a lot of research in Philippines in this area. And also Japanese and Balinese men, which is a research that I did with Mika Toyota. And then also about research on Nikkei Jin and in the pre-war period in Philippines, research on the Japanese and Southeast Asian children from the Japanese and Southeast Asian marriages. Okay, so in this area of migration and trans experiences, we also see increasing interest on studying about the Japanese who move to Southeast Asia, like Japanese expatriates in Singapore and Thailand and so forth, and also the Japanese who moved to Southeast Asia for retirement. Okay, so all these are areas of studies that became possible because of the actual experiences of people who are living there, and it also leads to a cross kind of space. It provides a platform for understanding cross-cultural interactions. But when we talk about relationship developments in Southeast Asia, I think one of the most important is, before that. So this is just a list of some of the research on Japan-Singapore engagements in NUS. Okay, sorry, I didn't know I talked so long. So these are like from pre-war era, we talk about Karayuki-san, business economy, history, all the way to gender, looking at Japanese women and businesses and pop culture and theater. Okay, so, but I think the most important part when we talk about spaces for dialogue is really the Japanese Studies Association in Southeast Asia. That was a ground-up effort that a group of scholars from Southeast Asian countries came together to start in 2006. So it was starting with some sense of crisis as well, because China studies was, developing and rising in that time, and we wanted to, as Japanese studies scholars, we were also afraid of, how Japanese studies may dwindle over time. But thanks to this effort to come together back in 2006, we have been doing quite regular conferencing in different parts of Southeast Asia. We really welcome all of you to come and join us. Next month, we are actually having it in Laos, in Vientiane. And again, of course, this has been possible because of really quite support from Japan Foundation. Okay, let me just hurry up. Another, important thing about this dialogue space is really the networking and collaboration. And we see, for example, recent Japan and US, Southeast Asia kind of funding opportunities has allowed for output such as this new book that's coming out next year, looking at Japan, and that gather together Japanese studies scholars and Southeast Asian studies scholars together to look at Japan, Southeast Asia interactions. And that has been quite an interesting experience for me, because usually Japanese studies scholars, we think differently from Southeast Asian studies scholars. So that kind of space exchange was really enriching for me. And the other picture is the most recent July summer camp, the WA 2.0, that was held in NUS, where students from Southeast Asia spend 1 week in NUS for lectures and field trips. Okay, I will just say that this one is another example of how a conference collated to a book volume, and this helps to further our research interests and expand the Japanese studies shift with publications. And this slide is just to let you know that when we talk about, all the things that we want to do, we really need support. And besides Japan Foundation and some corporate foundation funding, in NUS, we have managed to set up a fund with Mitsui support, especially to develop Japanese studies in Southeast Asia. So this fund has allowed for Japanese studies scholars and students from the region, from Southeast Asia, to for different kinds of programs, and even to support them for conference and so forth. So this is also important if we talk about how do you advance with enough support. And I'll just end with this book called New Frontiers in Japanese Studies. I think we talk about how we could develop space to joint research to interests of Japan and Southeast Asia topics and so forth. So it relates back to what I talk about, Japan Plus model or polycentric kind of engagements, as well as Asia interreferencing. But here, I think New Frontiers in Japanese Studies is also bringing us to this awareness that we need to see Japan, as a viewpoint that's, because Japan is one of the major world economies and cultures, that we should look into how we can integrate more fully into global and transnational discourses. I mean, I can talk more about this, but especially when we look at how Japanese studies have this, tension of interdisciplinary and area studies discourses earlier. But let me end here, and I look forward to more engagements and discussion throughout the day. Thank you very much.
タン先生、ありがとうございました。続きまして、パネルセッション1、越境する日本研究に移らせていただきます。このセッションでは、東北大学統合日本学センターの助教のタイルンロート・アジャナー先生、ウェイ・ラン先生、ダミコ・ジョン先生に15分ずつご報告いただき、その後、タン・レンレン先生に加わっていただき、ディスカッション、フロアとの Q&A の時間を合わせて30分取ります。では、まずはじめに、タイルンロート先生にご報告いただきます。先生はプリンストン大学で博士号を取得され、現代日本文学・文化、東アジア研究などの分野についてご研究されています。本日の報告のタイトルは Anxiety at Atmosphere 1980s Japan and the Urban Landscape です。それではタイルンロート先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Hello. Hi, good morning everyone, and thank you to the Japan Foundation and to the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies at Tohoku University for giving me this wonderful opportunity to share my work. So without further ado, let me begin. In 1980, Tanaka Yasuo publishes Somehow Crystal, amidst new social historical transformations accompanying the 1980s flourishing consumer culture. Winner of the Bungei Prize and nominee for the 1981 Akutagawa Prize, the novel became a national bestseller that sold more than 800,000 copies in Japan. In retrospect, the bestseller came to epitomize the conspicuous consumption and materialistic lifestyle associated with the years leading up to Japan's bubble economy. Somehow Crystal documents the lifestyle of college student and part-time model named Yuri. Her daily routines are determined by her spontaneous moods and what feels good, or kibun ga ii mono. She has a casual romance with Masataka, a boy she meets at a Roppongi disco while her boyfriend Junichi is away. However, she realizes that she is not attracted to Masataka like she is to Junichi. Junichi returns, and a distressed Yuri realizes her emotional dependence on him when she learns that he, too, has had a casual fling. To make it worse, the girl also happens to have good taste in fashion. So, as you can see, apart from this fairly uneventful plot, what stands out is the novel's inclusion of 442 footnotes, explaining specific references to brand names, music, restaurants, and trendy places in Tokyo that appear in the story world. These footnotes call attention to itself, functioning like a meta-critique of the main narrative, or as an entirely different text altogether. The main text narrated by Yuri is on the right side, and as you can see, the left are all annotations from the footnotes. Somehow Crystal has therefore been characterized as catalog literature, or even advertisement, for its resemblance to shopping catalogs and city guidebooks. Rather than reading like a novel, it was read as a lifestyle map of Tokyo's latest trends. Previous scholarship has centered on the question of whether the footnotes are a critique or glorified celebration of consumerism. Building on these dialogues, in this presentation, I approach the text through reading mood and feeling. Following previous works that treat affect as environmental and social attunement rather than interior psychology, I argue that mood operates as infrastructure in early 1980s Tokyo. In Somehow Crystal, mood appears in two contradictory registers, feeling good and what I term anxiety in the air. Feeling good is framed as a prominent everyday decision-making force for Yuri and her peers. On the other hand, I read anxiety in the air as an ambient, shared collective mood or atmosphere, and also as a modality of perceiving and articulating the disoriented encounter with Japan's early 1980s prosperity. I show how tension between these two moods are made legible through ambient atmosphere in the main text and through the footnotes, generation of a modality of disordered reading. Situating the novel with contemporaneous women's catalog magazines, I show how feeling good is produced and circulated as shared atmospheres that condition perception and mediate consumption, while at the same time manifesting as individual autonomy. Tracing anxiety in the air reveals these infrastructures of control, such as the molding of the identity of consumer within Tokyo's branded urban environment. Following Sian Nai, I understand anxiety as a diffuse, ongoing, and non-cathartic mood. Precisely in its low-intensity persistence, anxiety in the air makes visible the regulation of bodies and the shaping of consumer subjectivity that would otherwise pass as the individual pursuit of what feels good. The novel makes legible anxiety as a diffuse, ambient atmosphere. It opens on a rainy weekday morning with Yuri in bed. She turns on the stereo, evaluating the soundtrack to her morning, and decides to skip class because she, quote, doesn't feel like going in this weather. At a glance, her days promise mobility and freedom under the pursuit of what feels good. Shopping, dining out, going to discos. Yet, the narration's nonchalance is shadowed by a subdued, persistent gloom. This low-affect mood is established through ambient techniques, repeated references to rain, melancholy soundtracks and song lyrics, pointed mentions of an aimless, lingering, somehow mood. Sound, weather, and atmosphere sets a foreboding tone as a backdrop to Yuri's extravagant lifestyle, rendering legible anxiety in the air. A sense of foreboding also stems from vagueness and a lack of active initiative in her daily life. Her curation of what to eat, where, and where to shop appear impulsive, yet she is portrayed as a passive observer in her own life. As in this quote, emphasis on mood and feeling good as a decision-making force complicates agency. Choice is reframed as operating beyond individual control. Yuri believes that she has the autonomy to choose what feels best, yet she concedes this choice is already predetermined. In a milieu that appears to offer endless lifestyle options, decisions are made by somehow moods, producing an overall passivity and emptiness in Yuri's routines. Some of these choices become legible when read alongside contemporaneous catalog magazines that advertise collective atmospheres and moods as personalized good taste. Titles such as An and Nonno supply a media ecology that consolidated lifestyle trends, ambient locations, and what feels good into collectible urban itineraries and desirable sensibilities. Some of you may be familiar with these spreads that came out in the early 80s. For example, a 1981 Nonno feature, Two Hottest Neighborhoods Today, Guide to Tasty Food in Shibuya and Daikanyama, catalogs latest hangout spots, accompanied by chatty descriptions and a stylishly illustrated map. These city guide columns strategically individualize trends, marketing them as private moods and refined taste, while appealing to a larger in-the-know collective. The style of the marketing that emerged in the 80s, termed kansei marketing, focused on feeling, targeting desire to differentiate oneself, while also belonging to what sociologist Fujioka Wakao calls the micro masses. In Somehow Crystal, Yuri's list-like digressions, accompanied by the footnotes, deliberately parodies these city guide features, directive tone, in-group exclusivity, and map-like sequencing. For example, for buying vegetables and meat, the Kinokuniya in Aoyama is good. As for fish, I'd go to Mejiya at Hiro or all the way to Tsukiji, even if it's a bit far. For bread, I'd stop by Daikanyama's Chei-Lui while taking a walk, etc. And it goes on and on for pages and pages. So in this combination of space and sentiment, feeling good functions less as inner psychology than as an urban milieu of shared sensibilities. In this way, the novel foregrounds the prevalence of mood as a decision-making force, while also showing that it is not an individuated choice, but an infrastructure that preconditions perception and choice. By maintaining a persistent, low-affect background mood, the novel makes palpable the oppressive dimensions of the feel-good life. This mood renders the landscape of conspicuous consumption as ominous rather than celebratory. Beyond the main narrative, the novel embodies an anxious atmosphere by introducing a disordered modality of reading through its footnotes. Unlike the smoothness with which Yuri is assimilated into consumption, the experience of reading the text itself is anything but feel-good. Readers are forced to constantly navigate back and forth between the right page, main narrative, and the left page footnotes. This design friction produces a dissonance between text and paratext. Yuri's feel-good daily life is contrasted with the footnotes mapping of Tokyo as a chaotic brandscape. This cartography demands constant attention, delays comprehension, and also disrupts time. In other words, anxiety and unease is not only represented, but embodied as a mode of reading. Rather than facilitating comprehension, the footnotes' oblique nature alienates readers. Many only offer an English gloss of katakana terms. Others explain an entry with additional foreign references, as in this example. The result is not clarification, but informational access through an endless chain of references. The footnotes' interruptions also divert attention away from Yuri's narration, decentering pacing and unsettling narrative continuity. The back and forth of split-page reading also demands constant active attention, preventing readers from settling into a more passive and seamless mode of reading. Furthermore, the footnote's chatty, self-referential tone draws attention to its constructedness, breaching the story world to address readers and interrupting immersion. In effect, they jolt us out of the smoothness of the branded landscape of the main text and invites us to perform the labor behind the feel-good economy. As such, an anxious atmosphere is embodied and enacted as a reading practice. The text proposes the modality of anxious reading as a way of perceiving and resisting the subjectivizing regulation of feeling good. If the main text branded milieu tunes bodies into shared atmospheres, the footnotes sever that attunement. The importance of new modalities of reading as a form of self-reflexivity is at the core of Tanaka's conception of the novel. In an interview, he explains his use of the word crystal in the novel, comparing crystal's physical property to refract light to the generational ability of characters who appear in the novel to selectively consume an excess of media information in a self-critical manner. Somehow, Crystal acknowledges its own status as a media object, challenging readers to selectively channel its presented excess of information in their own ways. The novel concludes with two seemingly unrelated official demographic charts: projected birth rate decline and population aging. Neither a part of Yuri's narratives nor the footnotes, these official charts foresee an ominous futurity. Set against Yuri's closing claims to be living, quote, without any serious worries or concerns, end quote, they instead recast immaterial unease as structural foreboding. By ending with demographic data, somehow Crystal names the concrete stakes of mood and ambience as infrastructure in a branded present. Reading for atmosphere points to how similar affective infrastructures of prosperity and control circulate across late 20th century urban contexts beyond Japan. To read for anxiety in the air is to see how governance operates and to see how affect is captured to shape identities and consumption. Thank you.
タイルンロート先生、ありがとうございました。続きまして、ウェイラン先生にご報告いただきます。先生はセントルイス・ワシントン大学で博士号を取得され、現代大阪文学、都市研究、マイノリティ研究などの分野についてご研究されています。本日の報告のタイトルは、大阪の終焉とその向こうに、Beyond the Margins of 大阪です。それでは、ウェイ先生、よろしくお願いします。
皆様、おはようございます。東北大学統合日本学センターのウェイランと申します。本日は国際交流基金フェローカンファレンスで発表の機会をいただき、大変光栄に思っております。実は2年前にも基金のフェローとしてカンファレンスに参加し、発表させていただきました。その際は多くのことを学ばせていただきました。この場をお借りして、これまで私の研究を支えてくださった基金の皆様に心より感謝申し上げます。本日のカンファレンスも皆様のお話を伺えることを大変楽しみにしております。それでは早速発表に入らせていただきます。本発表は2010年以降の3つの YouTuber 動画における大阪市西成区の釜ヶ崎の表彰をめぐり、動画における視点の相違点と倫理の問題について考察いたします。釜ヶ崎は現在、日本国内最大の日雇い労働者の町である同時に、労働運動の拠点という性格を有しています。また近年、労働者の高齢化に伴い、生活保護受給者の町にも変わりつつあります。近年の釜ヶ崎に関わる研究では、釜ヶ崎の近年の釜ヶ崎に関わる研究では、釜ヶ崎の形成史、労働者支援、野宿問題などに焦点を当てたものが特に蓄積されています。これらの研究で観客されてきたのは、釜ヶ崎の住民たちがいかに自らの歴史と生活を語ってきたのであります。釜ヶ崎は1930年代から現代に至るまで小説と漫画と映画などのメディアに繰り返し描かれてきました。その中の一部の文芸作品は釜ヶ崎の貧困と危険性を強調し、また別の作品は住民たちが送っていた不安定な生活を主流社会からの逃避と結びつけることで、この地域をロマン化してきました。私の博士論文は1930年から1970年までの近代大阪文学における近隣地区の表彰を中心に、特に大阪市出身の作家はいかに外部からの視点で大阪のマイノリティを創造し描いたのかについて検討いたしました。本発表は釜ヶ崎の住民自身による内部からの語りを分析する重要性を踏まえ、当事者の視点を明らかにする試みとして YouTuber 動画を事例に取り上げております。発表者は新しいメディア景色は主流の価値観を問い 直し、表現の自由を広げているように見えますが、同時にステレオタイプの再生産やプライバシーの侵害といった倫理的な問題を抱える危険性も共有していると主張しています。近年、YouTuber や Vimeo などの動画配信プラットフォームでは、釜ヶ崎を犯罪と危険の街として描くセンセーショナルな映像が拡散しています。最初の例として取り上げるのは YouTuber オリエンタルパールが作った動画 Japan's worst slum is nothing like your country 日本最悪のスラムはあなたの国と全く違うです。動画の中では彼女が街で出会った男性に私は有名な YouTuber で東京で住んでますと自己紹介したらその男性に道の案内を依頼しました。やがて彼らは三角公園に到着しビールを飲んでいる高齢の男性たちと出会いました。一緒に味噌汁を飲みながらオリエンタルパールは私はデトロイト出身です。そこは西成よりずっと犯罪率が高い場所ですよと言いました。みんなが一緒に笑って、その中の一人の男性が西成のことは悪く言われることが多いと言いました。会話の終わりに英語を少し話せる男性が私は長崎出身で被爆者の残世です。祖母が生き残ったのですと語りました。釜ヶ崎は野宿者、失業者、被爆者などを受け入れてきた包摂的な地域として知られています。彼女はこの発言の重要な意味を理解せず、すごいですねと短く返しただけです。そして公園を離れた後カメラに向かって驚きました。本当に驚きました。I'm so surprised と語りました。その後、彼女は外国人旅行者2人になぜ釜ヶ崎に泊まっているのかと尋ね、ここは日本最大のスラムですと説明して、カメラで彼らの驚きを記録しました。最後にナレーションで、日本の本当の姿を知りたければ釜ヶ崎に来るべきだと湿りくくりました。無論、オリエンタルパールの動画は視聴者に釜ヶ崎の一面を紹介しています。しかし動画の構成はあらかじめ決められたナラティブに従って住民の行為や彼らとの関係の進化への関心が欠けています。次に紹介したいのは日本人の YouTuber オタキンが作った動画です。動画の中には釜ヶ崎で暮らしている女装家の恵子メリさんを取り上げた映像もあります。オタキン自身は釜ヶ崎の出身ではありませんが、恵子さんは自分の友達と言いました。最初の動画では釜ヶ崎の安価な食べ物のクローズアップ映像と三角公園の夜景から始まります。不気味な音楽を背景に公園のベンチでメリさんと会話する様子が映しています。ある場面でオタキンが持参したピンク色のウィッグをメリーにかぶるように促し、さらにメリーに愛用の人形ポポちゃんを視聴者に見せるよう提案します。その後、オタキンはポポちゃんの顔をカメラに極端に近づけ、単純に怖いですねという字幕を付け加えました。しかし、ポポちゃんはメリーにとって大切な存在であり、その扱い方には大きな問題があります。もう一つの例として、オタキンはメリーのアパートまでに同行し、メリーの私生活に関わる質問を投げかけ、部屋の散らかり具合についてコメントしました。表面的には釜ヶ崎を観光しに来たオリエンタルパールとは異なり、オタキンは地域の人と親しくなっているようには見えますが、実際にはオリエンタルパールと同じく、オタキンも外部からの差別的な眼差しの下で釜ヶ崎の人の生活をコンテンツ化し、収益を得ています。実は私はメリーと一緒に釜ヶ崎で10ヶ月間炊き出しをしたことがあります。メリー本人にオタキンの動画についてどう思うか尋ねたところ、好きではないです。あの人は私の友達ではない。という答えをもらいました。メリーさんは自分の YouTuber チャンネルねねメリにシナリオを進めてくれました。私はメリの動画にはきっとオタキンが撮った映像と世間が釜ヶ崎への差別を訴えたのではないかと予想していましたが、実際には彼女の動画の多くは日常の生活の中の楽しく忘れがたい瞬間を記録しようとしていました。メリの動画は大まかに次の4つのカテゴリーに分けられます。メリが一人でカラオケで歌う動画、釜ヶ崎で開催された祭りの記録、東京の公園で撮影されたライブ配信動画、子ども向けの日本の昔話、アニメーションの抜粋。これ見たことある？というタイトルの動画はテレビ番組の一部を録画したものです。番組の中でテレビクルーは釜ヶ崎の路上に1日だけピアノを設置し、地元の人々がどのように反応するかを観察しました。最初は誰も弾こうとしないまま時間が過ぎてしまいましたが、そこに現れピアノを弾き始めたのがメリでした。メリが弾いたのは日本の有名な童謡「猫を踏んじゃった」です。この映像ではテレビを通してメリの姿が紹介されていますが、音楽への強い情熱を持つ人としての印象は彼女自身の動画の中での姿とよく重なっています。別の動画ではメリが2人の仲間と共に賛美歌を歌っています。その温かく心に響くメロディは歌い手と視聴者を深く結びつけます。コメント欄には感動した、初めて賛美歌を聞いたけど勇気をもらったといった声が多く寄せられています。音楽を通してメリは釜ヶ崎の人々、そして視聴者とつながり、お互いの違いよりも共通点を見出しているのです。オリエンタルパールやオタキの動画は対照的に、メリの作品はリアルに感じられるのは釜ヶ崎というコミュニティを内部の視点から描いているだけではなく、判断や偏見ではなく共振と共感を持って人々を温かく見つめているからのです。新しいメディアはコメント欄を通して視聴者が制作者と交流することができて、その制作過程に影響を与えるという点が独特です。オリエンタルパールのような YouTuber が制作した釜ヶ崎を題材とした動画はすでに100万回以上再生されています。こうした動画は資本主義的な欲望に突き動かされて作られているだけではなく、視聴者の需要を反映しながら新たな需要そのものを生み出していると言えます。倫理的な責任は制作者だけではなく、私たち視聴者一人一人にも問われているのです。発表は以上です。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
ウェイ先生、ありがとうございました。続きまして、ダミコ・ジョン先生にご報告いただきます。先生はイェール大学で博士号を取得され、日本近世史、経済史などの分野についてご研究されています。本日の報告のタイトルは、近世日本の株仲間に関する一考察、東北大学附属図書館所蔵の小谷家文書を中心に、A New Perspective on Guilds and Markets in Early Modern Japan です。それでは、ダミコ先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Thanks so much for having me. My name is John D'Amico. I'm an assistant professor at the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies here at Tohoku University. Today I'm basically talking about new research that all three of us actually started work last year in the fall. And this research looks at documents at Tohoku University, so it's on a sort of work in progress on what I've been basically doing on the side besides my book project over the past year. So my slides are in Japanese, but I'm going to talk in English in the spirit of integration. So basically, I'm looking at guilds in early modern Japan, and for those of you who don't know, there's organizations called kabunakama, where they pay certain kinds of taxes to the authorities, whether they're the shogunate or the domain, in this case, Senda domain. and in turn they get monopoly privileges over certain kinds of goods and trade. And basically what I'm interested in is to what extent these organizations actually affected the development of the market economy in the Tokugawa period. And this is actually a really old question in the field of Japanese history, but I wanted to get at it using these sources from, and I'll talk about them a bit, from Sendai domain, where we are at Tohoku University, because basically I think that a regional perspective on these organizations can yield a lot of different insights than just the existing narratives. So I have a lot of slides on secondary literature. Oh God, I just moved ahead so quickly. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, so I'm going to very briefly go over some of the secondary literature. But basically, the reason why people care about guilds in this time period is the grand narrative of economic history in the Tokugawa period says that by the 18th century, these guilds form, they have these strong monopolies, they wield this influence, they're tied with the samurai, and then over the course of the late 18th century, the 19th century, new merchants emerge, outcompete the old merchants, and there's a new logic of free trade that happens. So this is the whole kind of alleged story arc of the economic history of early modern Japan. And how you evaluate the guilds basically determines what you think about what happens in the market economy. Now in recent years, people have looked at this old story and they're like, well, actually, this story of binary opposition between privileged guild merchants and new merchants and all this is kind of nonsense. But as of yet, no one has really proposed a compelling alternative narrative. You still see, if you read econ history textbooks or things like that, you still see this kind of story where there were guild merchants, they're very conservative, and they get outcompeted by new merchants, and then the market changes. That's the kind of way people talk about it. And for Sendai domain too, there is some research. Oh, sorry, I should point here, right? But most of it falls into the previous paradigm. So there's the main researcher, Park Kyung-soo, who writes that these guilds in Sendai basically disrupted and caused severe impediments to the natural development of a market economy. So that's the kind of way people think about these guilds often, is that they have this immense ability to shape markets, and they largely shape them in a negative way, although there's also literature in economics that says the opposite. But in any case, the general story is that these guilds have this massive impact on the market. And one thing I want to argue today is essentially that this is nonsense, that the nature and development of these guilds is much more flexible than people think, that we need to, I think most importantly what I want to talk about is how the interests of these guilds as commercial organizations and their membership are actually often conflicted with each other, and this idea that there is a simple one-to-one relationship with these guild privileges and what kind of market results they produced is just not true. And then I want to also focus on the fact that I'm doing this in Sendai. So all that previous literature I was talking about is largely based on the experience of Edo and Osaka and places like this, whereas in Sendai the guilds undergo a completely different trajectory where they actually last till the end of the Tokugawa period, and there is not really the same sense of a complete breakdown in the system as the existing narrative shows. So these are some of the documents. So as part of the collaborative research project I'm doing at the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies, we're actually digitizing these. And so I think by early next year, I think around 400 of these, of the several thousand, will be up, available to do in the digital archive. And what's cool about these documents, for a number of different reasons, is they're basically the only consolidated source for the study of economic life, guilds, anything related to economic topics for Sendai domain. Obviously, Sendai experienced pretty severe damage in the fire bombings in World War II. So the number of sources for the study of urban life is very limited, and so the Kotani sources, which these are called, are quite valuable. And just to give a sense of where we are, so we're in Sendai over here. And all throughout the Japanese archipelago, these different colors are the different domains, and then there's the white area in the middle, which is all the different shogunal territories. Basically, in all these different jurisdictions, there's different guilds. They have different monopoly rights. In order to trade in Sendai domain, you need to be a member of the Sendai, of these 6 guilds. And there's some goods that were in a response. This is another good map of Sendai. So where are we? That's us in Sendai right here. So Sendai domain is quite large. It has 750,000 people. And the basic function of these guilds was they wanted to monopolize all of the imports into the domain for guild goods, move them to Sendai Castletown, and then sell them throughout to other parts of the country. Now, the entire south of the domain was from the beginning outside of the privileges of these guilds. So it's a very complicated, very difficult to explain system that I cannot do justice in 15 minutes, but that's basically what they're doing. And what's interesting about Sendai domain is how many different market areas there are. So you have the south, you have this huge coastline, you have the north, the Kitakami River up here, and there's a lot of different sub-markets within the region. And in theory, this is how trade was supposed to work. So the guilds in Sendai have relationship with guilds in Edo, and and then the ships that the domain sends, because they send rice from Sendai to Edo every year for tax rice and things like this. The ships on the way back, they bring guild goods into ports like Ishinomaki, that then they get put on smaller boats and brought to Shiogama, then they get brought to Sendai, where they pay taxes on customs taxes. And the whole concept of the system is that all these goods are supposed to gather first in Sendai and be under the control of the guilds, and then the domain gets taxes and the merchants get monopoly privileges. So that's how the system is supposed to work. And they emphasize this repeatedly, so the guilds are always explaining to the authorities how the system is supposed to work. So this is one example of that, where they're basically saying that, you know, you're supposed to bring everything to Castle Town, and then all the transactions happen there, even though it kind of would make sense for people to trade in the port when the goods arrive, but they kind of bring it forcibly to the Castle Town and finish the transaction there. That's the idea. But then what's interesting, though, is in practice for many guild members, by the late Tokugawa period, they're already just trading in the countryside normally. So in theory, even though these guilds are supposed to be about monopolizing goods within the castle town, they're actually doing most of their business in the countryside itself, trading directly with people, and then shipping it directly from the countryside. So even guild members are doing trade that, in a sense, is supposed to be in violation of the kinds of trading routes that guild members are supposed to use. And basically that looks something like this. So they have producers of the goods they're dealing with. In this case, this is Materia Medica, because the Kotani records are mostly about Materia Medica. And there's local stores in Materia Medica, and they buy them there, or they buy them from producers, and then they ship them out directly. So there's no point at which this goes to the castle town, and it's very easy for this to be completely unregulated by the domain. So the guild merchants themselves, who are supposed to have this system of privilege that enforces their monopoly, actually in many cases follow trade routes that are indistinguishable from the new merchants that are supposed to somehow be violating their privileges and rights. And the guild itself, when they talk about their own trade, what I find interesting is, in the existing literature, you have a lot of reliance on prescriptive sources that describe how the trade's supposed to work, like these kind of rules for the guilds or things like that. But when the guilds are not in those kind of sources, but in other sources, when they talk about their own trade, they're basically saying that, yeah, we go out, we negotiate with buyers, and we negotiate them one-on-one, and we set prices one-on-one, and it's this system that's very fluid, and there isn't necessarily this sense of like, oh, they as a guild, they're setting prices, they're doing stuff like that, but in practice, they are basically trading on a one-to-one basis with producers in a way that's not that distinguishable from what any other merchant would do in this situation. And the other thing that's interesting when in these documents is, this is just, again, these are just like one examples of different things I've been finding in these sources, but there's actually a number of these examples over and over again. There's lots of cases where the guild head themselves and guild members themselves petition the domain in opposition to the existence of guild monopolies. So there's this old story of how guilds are supposed to work is that there's these monopolistic guilds holding onto their privileges and these new merchants working to violate them. But what's interesting is that in the sources themselves, you see cases where the guild merchants themselves are in opposition to monopolies in certain cases. So they're in favor of you have free trading monopolists or pro-free trade monopolists. It's very confusing. Let's see, where am I at? And I think one thing that's interesting about this is that due to this flexibility in how people, how the guild is towards new kinds of trade and new traders, in Sendai domain at least, the number of guild members for the only guild we have good stats for, actually basically most of them come in the 19th century when the guild system is supposed to be in free fall and collapse. So in the almost exact opposite of what's supposed to be happening in Edo, Osaka, places like this, in Sendai, actually you could argue that the peak of the guild system is in the 19th century when it's under allegedly most threat. So there's all sorts of, I think, interesting contradictory things that we can talk about with the nature of the market structure in Tokugawa Japan when you stop looking at the center and start looking from outside. And I have one more little example here. Yeah, and here's another example of just how, in practice, how flexible the guild system worked. So I think in the beginning when I showed that huge chart of how trade was supposed to work and how there's all this checking in the ports and they go from port to port and then to the castle town, all of that depended on making sure that the goods that arrived in port were guild goods or non-guild goods. But there's actually they had systems of checking this, but in practice, a lot of merchants, what they would do is they would just say they were bringing goods to the castle town for guild merchants, and then they would be allowed to import into the domain. And then after that, there's actually very little meaningful regulation that the domain or the guilds could do. And this is in the guild's own records. They recognize this is the same document as before when they're saying how well their system works and how everything is supposed to work to the domain. They pretty openly acknowledge that it's actually very easy to get around any of the regulations in the system. So to wrap up, basically what I want to argue here is that there's an extraordinary level of flexibility to the system, that existing arguments that sort of paint Tokugawa trade and as being sort of dominated by these systems of guild control. I think there's ways in which we can kind of rethink some of those, at least from the regional point of view. And there's a lot of variation and flexibility depending on the type of good being traded, the time period, and the region. And in contrast to, I think, the existing literature, it's very hard to say that the guilds in Sendai, at least, were somehow like actively restricting the development of a free trade system of market economy. In many cases, they themselves were violating their own privileges. They were ignoring guild rules, and they were ignoring the domain's own interests. And so there's a lot of additional work I want to do on this material, but I hope today you get a bit of a sense of what's kind of exciting and interesting in these documents, and I hope to kind of continue developing it on collaborative lines in the future. So thanks so much.
ナミコ先生、ありがとうございました。ここからはタン先生とのディスカッションとフロアとの Q&A の時間です。フロアとの Q&A につきましては、マイクの係が待機しておりますので、ご発言は手を挙げてマイクがお手元に届いてから、また最初にお名前とご所属をよろしくお願いいたします。
Okay, so I'll go first, right? Okay, thank you very much for three very diverse topics, and I think that's the beauty of area studies, of Japanese studies, that we can actually learn a lot more things from our area attending, an event like this. So the title of this panel is Transborder. So I was actually asking Japan Foundation, what do they mean by transborder? Because every one of the research is actually very particular, in the area that you're working in. So maybe I use this one. Okay. So I will just maybe comment a little bit, ask some questions for clarification for each speaker, and then you can either answer first before we open to the floor. It's okay. So I'll keep it short. So first is Ajana Sensei. Thank you for introducing this literature, this piece of work, Somehow Crystal. I'm just wondering, thinking from the lens of transborder, how you can connect with, other areas as well. How is it that when you're focusing on a young female's consumption in 1980s in Tokyo, tells a larger story? How does it tell you a larger story of what larger anxiety, contradicting the feel-good emphasis? By the way, what is it in Japanese, the anxiety in the air? What do you call it? What is it in Japanese?
I call it just HUANG in general. I'm not sure
HUANG.
How, it's a term that I came up with.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So it's not in the literature. Okay.
But the kibun no feel good is it's in the text very very often.
Okay. Yeah. So to me, actually, the most important part of this book is at the end, right? When it ends with this, you say that it ends with the figure on population aging and birth rate 4, right? Yeah. So that that seems, in your conclusion, it talks about, this concluding with two seemingly unrelated official demographic charts on projected birth rate, decline in population, aging. So, yeah, so they seem unrelated to the protagonist, but what more can we understand in a broader sense of what this book may want to convey from this broader, showing this broader trends at the end. Okay, so and lastly, if we approach from a more trans-border kind of perspective of integrating humanities and social science, then how would that shift your narration of the tension of feel good and anxiety? Yeah, so sorry, I think I'm also not in my area, so I'm just trying my best to try to understand as well from a new perspective. So for your understanding. Okay, the second presentation is way sensei desu ne. So let me find the. Okay, it's very interesting topic, and I think you did show us a lot of content in that sense of the videos that was shown and the protagonists there. I'd like to know more about your methodology. How do you select the media? I mean, there must be a lot of media out there. How do you select it? What is your criteria? And do you interview the people who make the films at all? It looks like you are quite close to the Mary, right? I mean, know Mary well, and she also happens to be kind of a YouTuber. But yeah, so I'm just interested in how that methodology that you adopt can tell us more about, that the comparative. Are you looking at comparative aspects, or are you looking at the kind of in and out of the study, and what do you what area do you see yourself in I think there are a lot of things you can do with that materials, right? I mean, a lot of areas of discussions and focus you can go into, but what is it that you are looking into exactly? Are you looking at media, kind of representation? Are you looking into using this media representation to help us see to a bigger window of understanding marginalization in Japan, or the creativity of those in the margin and so forth? So I'm just wondering, what is it that you would like to do to know more from these materials? Okay, and the third speaker is Dr. Amiko Sensei desu ne. I'm very impressed by the read. Do you read all the old texts? Goodness, this is so impressive. Yeah, it's an entirely new area for me, and I enjoy learning a lot about this existence and operations of this guilds. But is the guilds in Sendai especially unique because of this, because of the flexibility? Yeah, and is it like when you ascertain that it is flexible? Is it because the main objective is to make more profit, or is there any other reasons that that this flexibility is transpired? And I think to have your work included in the contemporary works here really show that when we talk about transborder, it's also a trans-time period kind of, it could be a trans-time period kind of cross-understanding. So how do you think that this, I'm just wondering, does this guilds and market structure influence or impact of current workflows, of guilds in Japan? Yeah. So sorry for my kind of messy question. So I hope, what should we do now? They should answer first, or they can pick up questions from the floor and then answer together? Okay.
Thank you so much. Should I go first? Okay, thank you very much for your questions and comments. So I realized that I didn't talk about my larger work as a whole, so this is a great opportunity for me to explain why I'm talking about this book. So I'm interested in the ability for affect and atmosphere, such as anxiety, to sort of travel across borders, across text, genre, and even across geographical border. Actually, my other chapter talks about how I look at how anxiety around consumption of Japanese goods, or an overflow of Japanese goods in 1980s Thailand, and its implications on national identity is my other text. And I think, for me at least, the link between the two makes a lot of sense, because in Somehow Crystal, I didn't get to show this paragraph, but so a lot of the annotations are American music, American food, American restaurants. So there's that, the shadow of America and post-war Japan kind of looming in the background context. And I think that Kato Norihiro talks a lot about how Yuri sort of embodies this Japan's dependence on the US. And for me, I'm more interested in how this is a framework for me to approach inter-Asian dialogues between Japan and Thailand in my other chapter. So I look at how consumption and anxiety travels across borders, because the other chapter that I look at how this incident around a Thai girl who pretends to be Japanese blows up and sort of initiates questions about what it means to be Thai or Japanese in 1980s Thailand. And I see a lot of similarity between these two. So there's an overflow of American music, American food in Somehow Crystal, which is not the angle that I looked at today. But in the other text, there's an overflow of Japanese goods in 1980s Thailand. And I sort of look at what anxieties around national identity it makes visible. So ultimately I'm interested in what does looking at what is felt and not seen tell us? And listening to your keynote, I was thinking about notions of Japan's hegemony in Southeast Asia, and how looking at how we consume and feel about popular culture can tell us more about inter-Asia dialogues on cultural hegemony and power relations. I should let the others talk. So I hope that answers some of your questions. Thank you very much.
I should sit here. So I feel that, yeah, it's interesting when you talk about what, like being a young person in Thailand or Japan feels in 1980s. Yeah, so it's actually, I remember in Singapore as well in 1980s and 90s, there's a lot of interest on Japanese culture, pop culture, starting with, I think, 1980s, early 1980s with Oshin, right? The TV drama and so forth in Thailand as well. And then I remember there were like survey asking students, do you want to be a Japanese? Do you like to be a Japanese? And actually there's quite a lot of interest, because young people feel that Japan is so cool at that time already, and then they wanted to learn more about Japan and so forth. Yeah, so that was probably the height of Japanese studies as well. Yeah, so but it's so interesting that only 10 years before, in 1970s, there was still a lot of tension, right, because of the war issues and all that was happening. So that great turnaround, in such a short time, is actually quite fascinating, and how the role of popular culture, plays such a very significant role in that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for your wonderful questions. So I would like to actually answer question 1 and question 3 first. For question 1, you asked me about my methodology, and for question 3, you asked me about the area. So basically, based on my understanding, how do I position myself in terms of methodology and fields? So actually, I want to say that what really interests me in my research is the relationship between the politics of form and the local identity. So for instance, like for Kamagasaki, I'm interested in how Kamagasaki, this neighborhood, has been represented in Japanese manga, literature, cinema. And so this YouTube is actually a new project. As I have explained, my main field is Japanese literature, but I was very interested in how like different media, because their affordances and media specificity, they can represent this topic across time in different ways. And another thing that I want to mention is that I realized that my dissertation mainly dealt with the representations of Kamagasaki by intellectuals, like literary by novelists and so on. So I realized it is very important to find how people narrate themselves and tell their own histories. I came across some like materials like Romusha Tose. So it's a collection of essays written by day laborers, Hiyadoi Rodosha in Kamagasaki in the 1970s. But other than that, I found very few materials like which people express themselves. So I saw this YouTube video showed their own voices. And about your second question, and also this is related to the first question, how I selected them. So actually, I was thinking of juxtaposing the videos from different perspectives to let people see how could a work or video be presented from the perspective of outsider, insider, and so on. But when I was browsing through YouTube and watching these videos, I found out they can also be categorized into different genres. So the first example by Oriental Pearl, people would actually think about it as, let's say, the so-called poverty porn. So somebody goes to a very marginalized and impoverished area and just say, I'm a privileged person, I'm civilized, look at this pathetic people. And the second genre is close to this genre of a reality show, which you would see on Japanese TV, because this Otakin asked Melly to wear this pink wig and asked her to try some worms actually, and ask her to do a lot of tricks to just basically let the audience consume this. And I think the third genre, I had a hard time, as I said, that I was expecting her just to criticize people's like discrimination and so on of this Kamagasaki, but she didn't. She just records everything that is memorable in her own life. I think that is a stance of resistance is enough to show people there live the similar life to ours. They share similar joys. They are humans as well. So it's a way to show they are living in a dignified life. They don't necessarily need pity from the outsiders. So, and also about your question, last question about this comparative aspect, I look at Kamagasaki's representation, literary, cinematic, and media representations across different times. I wanted to actually think about the universality or the fuhensei of this Kamagasaki Mondai. Of course, it's related to the issue of precarious labor after the bubble economy collapsed, and also the issue of gentrification. We all know that Hoshino Risotto was built next to Kamagasaki, which drives the land of the price of the land up, and there's this issue of forcible eviction of unhoused people and so on. So one material I encountered is about this sanitization movement of the Fifth Street, if I remember correctly, in New York. So it's also happened in other countries as you see this kind of marginalized situation and gentrification. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks so much for your questions. I'll be very quick. On the issue of flexibility, so there's essentially two ways you can categorize these organizations. Some of them have fixed memberships and others don't. And so the one that I'm looking at here doesn't. And so it's much, but that's not unique to Senda. You can see those throughout the archipelago. So there's certain representativeness there. And then the other thing is, even in Sendai with the fixed membership associations, I have, again, not these sources, but other sources that show how even guild members in those organizations were engaging in illegal trade because it's inconvenient for them too. And so this gets to the question of why this flexibility exists. It's because I think there's two levels of why these organizations exist. One is for the merchants, obviously they would like monopolies in the same way that any businessman today would love to have a monopoly, I think for any reason, right? But at the other level is they're designed to facilitate the control of the samurai authorities and tax goods. And so when it comes to increasing the regulatory possibility of these organizations or these trading systems in order to increase taxes or increase the visibility of trade to the authorities, there's actually a lot of resistance there. So I think that kind of dynamic where there's merchants, even guild merchants, are fine sacrificing some of their privileges in exchange for being less visible to the state, essentially. So I think that's the kind of dynamic that explains why this flexibility exists. And I suspect, although obviously there's tons of local studies on guilds across all of Japan and like tons and tons of like micro studies and things like that. So it's almost impossible to say anything in general about anything. But I suspect that dynamic exists to a greater or lesser degree in any context. And then on the issue of sort of I guess spatial or thinking about space, I think there's kind of two levels here that are interesting maybe to develop further. One is something I sort of gestured to, showing all the different borders that existed within the Tokugawa polity itself. You know, obviously there's a lot of movement across different regulatory regimes in the Tokugawa period by merchants. And in these documents, actually, I couldn't do a detailed case study of some of the more interesting sources, but there's a really interesting case where merchants in Sendai are collaborating with merchants in Sakata and in Mogami, so basically across the Tohoku region, and they are essentially engaging in arguments about tax policy with domains, multiple domains across that entire area. So they're not bound by the Tokugawa conception of political space in these specific domains. They're thinking of like a broader Tohoku economic region, and they're arguing that way. So there's new spatial imaginaries that are emerging in these documents at the local level. And then I think on a more, I guess, traditional transnational sense of the term, what's interesting about the sources I was looking at today is their materia medica trade. So they involve both hyper-local level things, like people are growing there's certain kinds of goods like senkyu and takusha, these certain kinds of herbs in Sendo domain at a very local level and doing that kind of trade. But they're also involved in the import of Korean ginseng. They're involved in Chinese medicine imports. And so there's multiple kind of spatial scales happening at the same time where in the same merchant house and set of guilds, they're both doing highly localized trade with a face-to-face basis with like farmers, but also they're involved in networks of exchange that stretch all the way into the rest of East Asia. So I hope that kind of answers both those questions. Thank you.
I have a question for Tairun Ruto Sensei. Very inspiring presentation. Thank you very much. My name is Andrew Fong. I'm from Columbia University, and with generous support from Japan Foundation, I'm a visiting scholar at Tohoku University this year. Actually, my specialty is Edo period art history. So my question, and this is rather remote, your research is maybe remote from what I do, but so my question may come off as a little superficial, especially in front of all the fellows that specialize in this. So the section that you cited from the novel that talks about, for bread, you go to Daikanyama, and for a walk, you go to Shibuya, or for curry, I guess you go to Jimbocho if you like that kind of curry. It reminds me a lot of the Heian period text literature by Sei Shonagon, Makura no Soshi, in three different ways. First of all, the almost fragmentary approach, the prose, and that iteration reminds me a lot of the Heian period text. But also, secondly, the almost guide-like but not really style. And also thirdly, I think the very fact that the text was written by a female writer, and even though when you read it, you can feel the sense of confidence in the writing, but also I think it reveals the anxiety in her expression of her preferences and desire. So I think in all these different aspects, I see great similarities between the Heian period text and the 1980s novel. So how should we position that in the longer tradition of Japanese literature, in terms of the longer history? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I obviously not very familiar with Heian Jidai literature, but I actually have thought that somehow crystal bears resemblance to, say, Shonagon's pillow book. And I mean, the tone and the voice and this sense of in-group exclusivity is very similar to me. But I think one point that I think I could address is that Tanaka Yasuo is a male writer, right? So I think at the time of its publication, somehow Crystal received a lot of criticism from the literary sphere. And then Saito Minako, who's a literary critic, came out to say that somehow Crystal actually, because it emulates the language of women's magazines, it's sort of, this in the know group is catered towards women rather than men. So there's a very gendered aspect there because the bundan, the word the bundan was male dominated, and Tanaka actually in some of the footnotes criticizes the literary sphere in Japan because he received a lot of critique for this text because it strayed very much so from conventional notions of what literature could be in terms of the footnotes. So it was criticized a lot for just being outright advertisement for references to brands. So in that sense, he sort of pushed, his reply is in some of the footnotes where he criticized literary critics in Japan for sort of advocating for their own brand through university names. So academic title is a sort of brand itself. So that's the way that he sort of criticizes the literary sphere. And in that sense, Saito Minako, a literary critic, says that he sort of positions his work away from the male-dominated literary sphere and more in line with the voices of women's magazines. So there's that sort of gendered aspect. But in terms of how he replicates Yuri's voice, I think, so I read the magazine, there are these columns where they ask people their opinions on the latest trends, and one of that is somehow Crystal. So it was like this big thing. So they asked people on the streets, what do you think of somehow Crystal? And a lot of the readers have commented that Tanaka really sort of captures the voice of the woman. So I think make of that what you do, but sort of it. So there's this very gendered aspect in the discourse surrounding the text as well. I'm not sure if that answers some of your question, and hopefully we can talk more after this. Thank you.
So thank you for the 3 wonderful presentations and the 4th as well. I actually want to ask a question based on Tong Sensei's comments. When we look at this idea of post-colonialism, I think that's maybe not quite enough or doesn't quite go far enough. And in Chen's Asia's method, he puts forward the idea of de-imperialization and this idea of that you have to actually not only change what's happened in quote-unquote colonies or post-colonies, but also in the metropolitan center. And so if we take Japan as a kind of empire or as a kind of a sub-empire, how can there be a real dialogue in the sense of it's not just countries in Southeast Asia that are consuming or elsewhere consuming Japanese culture, but that Japan studies actually changes the mindset of people who are in the center. And so that's kind of a question for anybody who wants to take that up. But yeah, how can there be a real dialogue in that sense that Japan studies, Japanese studies can change the mindset of people living in Tokyo or in Japan in general?
Yeah, this is a great question because, when we talk about dialogues, we always see Japan as fixed, and then we, the partners as the one that's moving. So how do we have dialogues that are able to shift attitudes in Japan as well? I think it's something that we should, in fact, think about, moving forward. Yeah. So, but rightly so for now, and it's really a lot of Japan as the fixed fixed image there, and then how do we change in order to engage with Japan?
So if you, I'm not sure whether I totally understood what you meant by mindset, but if you're referring to these two following things, I think I could try to answer. One is this, as Adachi Sensei has also mentioned, this conference is taking place in Tohoku, right? So we know there's a center periphery framework or diagram both between Japan and its past colonies, let's say, or Southeast Asia and this Eurocentric world, let's say, East and West, let's just simply call it. So I think changing the mindsets also depends on how you define it, changes the methodology, the approach, or the stereotypes that we talked about today. One thing I think is to really important to show this case studies of local culture, like in Osaka, in Sendai, or even in Tokyo, to manifest that modernization, this process does not only happen in the metropole. This has been discussed by many scholars. It also, like, there are possibilities, potentials in local spaces, and we need to, as scholars, to argue for this contradiction and potential happening there, right? And I think another thing, if jump outside the box of academia to think about, I think as scholars, the responsibility is also to think about more platforms for public speaking and public engagement to try to talk about how we approach Japan, we approach Center Tokyo, we approach our own regionals in various ways through different forms. Thank you.
But I mean, just like when I first studied Japan, my master's thesis was on Okinawa. So I was studying ikigai of older Okinawans, and I was actually very fascinated by Okinawa. And when I wanted to do my PhD, and I said I want to do Okinawa, my anthropologist friends say, no, you shouldn't, because then you become an Okinawan specialist, not a Japan specialist. Yeah, so I think it's for those of us who are studying the peripheral in Japan, we actually also have double identity in that sense. Okay, I think maybe one last question. I think is there 1 minute left? Oh, it's already over, time's up. Okay, so yeah, thank you everybody for joining this panel, these three very interesting, exciting papers. Let's give a round of applause to the speakers.
では、皆様ありがとうございました。では、タン先生、タイルンロート先生、ウェイ先生、ダミコ先生にもう一度拍手をお願いします。以上で午前のセッションを終了させていただきます。それではお時間になりましたので、パネルセッションに共同競争の場としての日本研究を始めさせていただきます。このセッションでは、国際交流基金日本研究フェローのラージ・ヤシュさん、ドゥルー・ハンネさん、高村ジェリーさんに15分ずつご報告いただき、報告は一つ終わるごとにディスカッション、さんとの先生とのディスカッションとフロアとの Q&A の時間を合わせて10分取ります。Q&A の時間を最後にまとめて取ることはいたしませんのでご注意ください。フロアとの Q&A につきましては、マイクの係が待機しておりますので、ご発言は手を挙げてマイクがお手元に届いてから、また最初にお名前とご所属をよろしくお願いいたします。このセッションでディスカッサントを務められますのは、東北大学統合日本学センター准教授、赤井公先生、助教、高天元先生、助教、ダミコ・ジョン先生です。では、まずはじめにラージ・ヤシさんにご報告いただきます。ラージさんはジャワハルラル・ネルー大学の博士課程に所属され、対日中は京都大学で日本とインドの同様の比較研究をされています。本日の報告のタイトルは、ビハールと日本の農業民謡における移住の比較分析です。それではお願いします。
皆様、こんにちは。 本日はこの場を借りて本発表の機会をくださった国際交流基金の皆様、そしてインドジャワハラルネル大学の指導教員ラクシミ先生、また日本京都大学の指導教先生、梶丸先生に心より感謝申し上げたいと思います。私の発表テーマは、ビハール州と日本の農業民謡における移住、その比較分析です。中で、インドのビハール州と日本の農村地域に伝わる農業民謡を一曲ずつ比較し、そこに描かれた移住というテーマを取り上げたいと思います。本研究の主な目的は、ビハール州及び日本における移住に関わる農業民謡を比較分析し、その中に共通している見られている文化的な要素や感情表現を明らかにすることです。この研究では、比較文化的アプローチを使い、音楽民族音楽学を視点から、ロークギートと日本の民謡を社会文化的な背景の中で考えました。方法はメリアムの理論に基づいて行いました。まず文献や現地録音から民謡を集め、次は内容をテーマごとに分けて社会文化的要素を分析しました。最後に結果を考察し、両地域の共通点と違いを明らかにしました。まず、インドと日本をそれぞれの民謡に合わせる言葉から確認します。ヒンディ語のロークギートは、ローク、つまり人々や世界とギート、つまり歌を意味します。ですから、人々の歌という意味になります。同じように、民謡という言葉は、日本で明治期以降にドイツ語のウォルクスライドや英語のフォークソングの訳語として独自に作られたものであり、漢石とは独立して形成された用語です。ロークギと同様に民謡は人々という意味があります。謡は歌を歌うことを指します。いずれも人々の日常生活の感情を表現した歌として知られています。次はビハール州では農業民謡は作物栽培の段階に応じて名付けられています。例えば、ロプニーという言葉は植え付けの歌、カトニーという歌は収穫の歌、ソホニーという言葉は草取り歌。このように農業とともに歌が存在し、生活のリズムを作っています。同じように日本においても、日本の農業民謡にも作業の工程に合わせて多様に分類されています。例えば、耕作前の田打ち歌、黒打ち歌があります。植え付け時、田植え歌、草取り歌などがあります。そして、収穫後の稲刈り歌、粉引き歌などがあります。ここでは、移住をテーマとしたビハール州のマガヒ語の民謡を紹介します。この歌は、嫁と姑の対話形式で展開されます。この歌の冒頭は、Kone umariya sasu nimiya lagaulan, kone umariya gelan videsava horam、これはヒンディ語です。という歌詞ですが、お母さん、夫は何歳の時にニームの木を植え、いつビデシュという、ビデシュ、つまり異国へ行ったことのですかという意味です。ここでビデシュという言葉は、異国、すなわち遠い土地を意味します。ですから、姑が答えます。खेलते कूदते बाबू निमिया लगौलन रेंगिया मिझेते गेलन विदेशवा हो राम 遊びながらニームの木を植え 近くにこの写真はニームの木の写真ですね。遊びながらニームの木を植え、青年になる頃にはビデシュへ旅立ちました。嫁は悲しみ、寂しさを込めて歌います。ファリゲルニミア、ラヘリゲルデリア、太陽なアエルモルビデスバホラム。ニームの木は育ち、枝は風に揺れているのに、夫は未だ帰らない。歌詞の終わりに次の場面が描かれています。ゴラチャラルアベバトレバトヒヤ。馬に乗った旅人が首を折りてくるのが見えた。嫁は旅人に問いかけました。せとむじえば、ナリアルケデスバケラム、あなたもココナッツの国へ行くのですか。すると、サスモルダグラン、ナナダムスケイラン、イテハティハマルチョトバイバホラム。姑が走り出し、義士がほほえみ、あれは私の弟だと言いました。これは日本に次に日本からの例としてホレホレ節を取り上げます。これは19世紀末から20世紀初頭にかけてハワイへ渡った日本人移民によって歌われた民謡です。これからこの民謡を音声を聞いていただきたいと思います。この歌はハワイのサトウキビ畑で働いていた日本人移民の苦労と放棄の思いを歌っています。アメリカに行こうか日本に帰ろうかという迷いに夢と現実の落差が現れています。厳しい労働や家族との生活の様子を通じて異国で生きている移民の悲しみと強さを描いています。次は比較分析です。ビハール州では 日本とビハール州と日本の民謡を比較すると4つのポイントがあります。はじめに家族との絆と郷愁、どちらの歌にも家族という軸が中心になります。マガヒ語の歌では家族の会話、嫁の問いと姑の返答を通じて離れて暮らす夫への思いが明らかになります。その一方、ほれほれ節では子供や孫の世代に移っても日本の郷愁が強く残ります。家族への思いと帰郷への願いが世代と場所を超えて共鳴しています。2つ目は自然の日々。自然は両書の歌で感情の媒介として機能します。マガヒ語の任務の木は時代の経過と夫の不在を象徴します。ほれほれ節のサトウキビ畑は日本人の移民労働や苦しみと忍耐、そして涙の場を象徴しています。自然は単なる背景ではなく人間の感情の延長として歌に生きているのです。女性は主な歌い手、どちらの民謡でも女性が中心的な歌い手です。彼女たちは家族を思い同様にの作業や生活を支える存在として描かれています。悲しみと強さの両面を体現する女性像が民謡の中心になります。次はカルチャルアイデンティティ、文化的なアイデンティティです。ビハール州のロックギートのビデーシュという言葉もホレホレ節の中に現れたシアンのハワイ国も文化的な境界を越えて経験を象徴しています。移住は地理的な移動だけでなく感情的文化的な移行、つまりカルチャルトランジションを意味します。次はそれではそういう点に移りたいと思います。ビハール州のロークギートのとホレホレ節の間には大きく3つの違いがあります。まずビハール州のロークギートはビハール州の人々が村から大都会へ働きに出るという国内移住を背景にしていますが、ホレホレ節には日本人労働者がハワイへ渡った海外移住の歌です。次にビハール州のロックギートは残された側の視点、つまり夫を待つ妻や家族の思いを歌っています。一方、ホレホレ節は移動した日本人の視点から移民として労働や現実を語っています。最後にビハール州の歌は待つことや郷愁を中心にした静かな感情表現ですが、ホレホレ節は労働の苦しみや異国で生きている強さを描いています。結論について話すと、以上の比較からビハール州と日本の農業民謡は文化も言語も異なりながら移住、家族愛、自然の象徴、女性の声、文化的なアイデンティティという共通のテーマによって結ばれていることが明らかになりました。これらの歌は単なる過去の労働歌でなく、人々の感情、社会の変化、そして文化的記憶を今に伝える生きたアーカイブで、こうした比較研究を通じて見えてくるのは、日本研究もはや日本だけを対象する学問ではなく、異文化との対話を通じて新しい地位を元に作り出す競争の場へ発展しました。これは私のビブリオグラフィーです。以上です。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
ラージさんありがとうございました。ではこれからディスカッションと Q&A のセッションに移ります。赤井先生お願いします。
東北大学の赤井と申します。よろしくお願いします。日本の近世後期から近現代における芸能演劇と文学を研究しています。近代以降に概念が形成された民謡、日本の民謡とインドのロークギートを移動という視点から比較していただいて大変興味深く拝見しました。ごめんなさい、拝聴しました。ありがとうございます。そうですね。まず何点かコメントをいくつかご発表に対してさせていただいて、その後最後ですね、ちょっとお伺いしたい点がございます。はい、まずですね、移動という意味で日本の移民はハワイだけではなくブラジルにもたくさん行っておりまして、で音楽民謡はどちらかというとブラジル移民の方がたくさん残っているんですね。ですのでハワイ移民の、しかもちょっと惚れ惚れ節なのかというところが少し気になったところです。でどちらかというと福島音頭や岩国音頭のような盆踊りの音楽の方が結構ずっと継承されて一世からずっとハワイでは残っていますが、惚れ惚れ節は一度その伝承が途絶えてしまっている、歌っていうのは多分ご存知だと思うんですが、その座敷歌としては残っていたんですが、一世から今回聞かせていただいたのはおそらくその畑で歌われていた方の歌、そのお座敷で歌われていた歌と畑で歌われていた歌が、かなり音調が違う、音楽の種類が違うで、座敷の方だけが残ってしまって、で今おそらく流していただいたのは2000年代以降に日系2世のハリー浦田さんが新しく音楽として作り上げたものだと思うんですね。ですので今回音楽ではなく歌詞の方の分析、歌詞はずっと残っているものなので分析いただいたと思うんですけれども、やはりちょっと継承されてきたものではない音楽性と、あとやっぱり今回女性が主な歌い手であったということをお話しされましたが、おそらくそれもハリー浦田中原ゆかりさんとかが指摘しているんですが、おそらくハリー浦田の戦略的な宣伝だったんだろうというようなことも指摘されまして、おそらく歌詞の中には女性が歌った部分もあれば男性が歌った部分もあって、でどちらとも言えない部分というのがこの後続いていくと思いますので、ちょっとですね惚れ惚れ節がそうしたいろいろな問題を抱えているので、ちょっと比較としてはいろいろと手続きが難しいなと感じました。でむしろですね、今回はインドの方は出稼ぎの歌ということで、であれば日本でも出稼ぎの歌はたくさんあるんですね。ニシンの、作業場歌、いわゆるソーラン節ですね。近年に入ってソーラン節となったものですとか、木遣り歌ですとか、やっぱり出稼ぎ非常に日本この辺りもですね、よく皆さん北海道にニシン漁で出稼ぎに行ったりということで、結局東北のものが北海道に残っていたりでっていう方がですね、多分たくさんあって、今回のものとの比較はいいのではないかなと思いました。でただ一方でですね、出稼ぎの歌は逆にやはり男性が主体になって作業家の面が強いんですね。農業家にも匹敵しますけれども、ニシンをめくって干してさばいてみたいな。なのでやっぱり今回むしろインドのロークギートは女性が明確に待っている側が主体であるというのは、おそらくその民謡の誰が歌い手で誰が聞き手でというですね、その民謡自体がどのように作られたかの文化的背景の違いというのがおそらく非常に強く出るのかなというふうに思いました。こうした差異が出て非常に面白いと思いますので、出稼ぎ歌の方などを見た方がいいのかなというの方がより今後ですね研究の視点に従って考えるといいのかなと思いました。で最後に質問させていただきたいんですが、これ私のインドのロークギートがあまり詳しくないので、音楽的な特徴というのはあるんでしょうか。その日本の民謡は、音楽的な研究上もう民謡音階と呼ばれるものがあると、主にですね日本の民謡はレミソラドを主体としたもの、もしくはヨナ抜き音階と呼ばれる西洋音階に即した時に特定の音階を抜いたものが、カチューシャカワイヤとか結構大体の民謡って同じような曲、民謡とか流行歌ですね、同じような音階なんですが、これはインドのロークギートの場合そういう何か特徴はあったりするのでしょうか。
ご質問ありがとうございました。私は初めに農業に関する民謡を研究したかったんですけれども、その時研究している途中 このような異常な問題に直面しました。その問題に直面して、私もインドの北インドのビハール州に属しているから、移住は主な問題として知られています。昔の歴史的な側面から見ても、現代の側面から見ても、移住は非常な問題です。ビハール州において。それについて研究しているとき、このような民謡歌に直面しました。その時どうして女性たちだけがビハールの州の場合にどうして女性たちだけこのような歌を歌っているかについて説明すると、その時社会学的な側面から見るとプッシュファクターとプルファクターがあります。プッシュファクターといえば田舎にはあまり仕事がない。同じ土曜に大都会で新しい工場などがあって、田舎に住んでいる人々は移動しましたね、大都会に。その時男性たちだけ移動しました。その場合に女性たちは村において畑で働いていた時、自分の家族の男性たちを覚えてこのような歌を歌っていた。が日本の場合には同じような移住に関する民謡を調べていた時、ほれほれ星という歌に直面しました。その時特にこの歌は女性によって歌われているんですね。その歌のトーンと感情などを聞いてもこのようなトーンがあります、アンダートーンがありますとよくわかります。それでこの歌を選びました。2つ目はロークギートの特徴の全世界においてもロークギート民謡の特徴は同じです。新しい作った歌詞はロークギートではないと思います。昔からこの世代伝統的な歌をみんなで一緒に座ってこのような祭りとか宴会とかパーティーなどがあって一緒に座ってこのような歌を歌っていたね。それは特徴です。特に民謡の特徴です。そうですね。私もそうですね。ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございます。そうですね。多分おそらく日本の場合は農作業があるときは出稼ぎに行かないでみんなで農作業をして農作業の歌を歌い、先ほど挙げていただいたような民謡を歌ってみんなで歌い、で農閑期に出稼ぎに行くので、やはり女性が待つという主体の歌があまり作られず、むしろ出稼ぎに行って辛いという農作業期の歌は女性も男性も歌いますので、でまた農閑期に出稼ぎに行った時に寂しいっていう歌を、主に働き手の男性たちが歌ったというですね、やはりおそらくインドの場合は年間を通して出稼ぎに行かれたりしているのかなと思いますので、やっぱりそうしたですね地理的なというか自然的な差異なども出てはいるものの、おそらく共通する部分というのもやっぱり違いと共通するところ、同じところがいろいろと見えてくると思いますので、非常に今後楽しみにしております。ありがとうございます。
ありがとうございました。
赤井先生、ラージさん、ありがとうございました。続きまして、高村ジェリーさんにご報告いただきます。高村さんはバッキンガム大学の博士課程に所属され、対日中は東北大学統合日本学センターで1870年代から1950年代にかけての西洋女性の日本に関する記述についてご研究されています。本日の報告のタイトルは Western Women as Agents of Cultural Dialogue in Meiji Japan です。それでは高村さん、よろしく。
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Hello. Thank you very much. My name is Jerry Takamura, and I'm from a PhD candidate from the University of Buckingham, and I'm also a hosted by Tohoku University. And I'd like to say thank you to the Japan Foundation and also to Tohoku University for hosting me, and to Professor Adachi for encouraging my research. Today I would like to speak about the cross-cultural encounters, co-creation, and transformative role played by Western women in Meiji Japan. A subject I have long been fascinated by. I will situate my work within the broader framework of Japanese studies as a living, collaborative field, one where cultural understanding is not simply observed, but made between people, texts, and histories. At the center of this discussion stands Clara Kaji, née Whitney, an American woman whose 25 years in Japan illuminate the real lived processes of cultural dialogue during the Meiji period. Her work presents cultural knowledge as a mutual creation rather than a one-way transfer. When we speak of Western women in Meiji Japan, it is tempting to imagine them as observers, travelers, missionaries, teachers. Yet many of these women did not simply look at Japan, they lived with it, negotiated it, and participated in shaping emerging forms of Japanese modernity. This presentation argues that Western women acted as agents of cultural mediation, occupying spaces that many of their male contemporaries could not enter. Domestic interiors, female society, educational institutions, and intimate everyday life. In doing so, they practice what we might now call co-created modernity, a shared relational production of knowledge and identity. Japanese studies has long been framed as the study of an other. I suggest we instead view it as a site of dialogue, negotiation, and mutual transformation. To study Japan is not simply to observe it, but to be altered by the encounter. Intellectually, emotionally, and ethically, something I believe my fellowship colleagues and I are doing in situ right now by being here in Japan. Clara's case allows us to see this vividly. Through linguistic immersion, intimate contact with Japanese households, and cross-cultural marriage, she moved from romanticized distance to situated, emotionally charged belonging. Her diaries become a record not of domination or conversion, but of learning, unlearning, and shared world making. Clara arrived in Yokohama in 1875 at the age of 15, the daughter of a Presbyterian family who viewed Japan as a land of both spiritual promise and cultural mystery. She lived in Tokyo, learnt Japanese, moved in intellectual and reformist circles, and eventually married Kaji Umetaro, entering one of the earliest recorded Western women, Japanese man marriages of the Meiji era. Her writing charts a profound arc, from missionary curiosity to respect and intimacy, from idealized portrayal to empathetic understanding, from outsider observation to shared cultural practice. Her diaries thus operate as a cross-cultural archive of becoming. Many Western women who entered Meiji Japan did so outside formal imperial structures. They were teachers, missionaries, wives, nurses, and travelers. Their gender positioned them inside Japanese domestic and social life, often more deeply than foreign men could access. They interacted with Japanese women and children, domestic workers, educational and religious communities, everyday rituals of food, cleanliness, etiquette, and sociability. Through these encounters, they negotiated domestic intimacy, female camaraderie, and the ethics of cultural presence. Their accounts are not grand imperial narratives, but small gazes, embodied, relational, profoundly human. Clara's earliest diary entry describes Japan as, I quote, "the land for which we have prayed so often," end quote. Japan appeared as a spiritual frontier, an imagined promised land. Like many women, she arrived prepared by Victorian missionary discourse, travel literature, and Orientalist romanticism. Yet her arrival offered dissonance. Ships in Yokohama Harbour, gaslights, European dress, and the rapid machinery of Meiji modernity. This confrontation between expectation and reality marks the beginning of her de-romanticization and genuine engagement. Many women recorded their first jinrikisha ride with delight, laughing, startled, exhilarated. The seemingly trivial mention of jinrikishas, rickshaws, by Western women upon their arrival in Japan often signifies more than a casual observation. The rickshaw, from Japanese human-powered vehicle, was first used in Japan in the 19th century. These references reflect their initial encounter with a strikingly different mode of transportation, which encapsulated broader themes of modernity, cultural differences, and power dynamics in Meiji-era Japan. Upon their arrival, Clara found these carriages immensely amusing, especially when her father tried to stop her mother's jinrikisha. And I quote, "But he might as well have said, 'Go on,' for the runner started at full speed. That was too much for me, and I fairly shook my jinrikisha with suppressed laughter," end quote. Clara's feeling of joy from this two-wheeled cart appears to have been shared by most Western women on their arrival in Japan. English travel writer Ella M. Hart Bennett, who in 1893 came to Japan as the companion of British Baroness Eleanora May Anithan, and who published An English Girl in Japan, wrote, and I quote, "On landing at Yokohama, we took rickshaws to the Grand Hotel. Never shall I forget my first ride in the quaint little carriage resembling a small buggy. Only instead of having a horse in the shafts, there was a funny little grinning man, dressed in a blue cotton garment, barefooted, with a large white hat like a mushroom on his head, on which was printed his name and number," end quote. The presence of a rickshaw puller, a human labourer physically transporting a foreign woman, subtly reinforced colonial and racial hierarchies in the minds of some Western observers. For missionary women and educators, in particular, their reliance on rickshaws also exposed contradictions in their own ideas of social justice. as they often sympathized with the plight of the laboring classes, while simultaneously benefiting from the cheap human-powered transportation. The jinrikisha, often described with fascination or amusement, became a symbol of the otherness of Japan, a visible marker of difference from Western urban life. I found that the way Western men describe the jinrikisha is in more practical terms rather than being amusing. Greek and Irish writer, translator and teacher Lafcadio Hearn, or Koizumi Yakumo, did not find the amusement that female writers so often allude to in their first encounter with the jinrikishas. Rather, he considered them practical and comfortable. And I quote, "The jinrikisha, or kuruma, is the most cozy little vehicle imaginable," end quote. Similarly, British Japanologist Basil Hall Chamberlain, who arrived in Japan, employed by the Japanese government 2 years before Clara Whitney, describes the practicalities of the rickshaws without mentioning the hilarity, as women writers did. And I quote, "The pleasantest sort of trip for a healthy man in which walking and jinrikisha riding are combined," end quote. Yet the rickshaw also symbolized female mobility and autonomy, allowing Western women to move independently in public space, a freedom often more constrained in their home societies. Small sensory moments, motion, laughter, the shock of physical proximity, became sites of cultural learning. Early entries from Western women often echo Orientalist tropes. Ritual politeness, mystery, theatrics, inscrutability. Clara writes of a true Oriental style, greeting and distrusts the sincerity of Japanese politeness, a moment of cultural projection and misreading. But rather than remaining fixed in Orientalist superiority, she moves through it. Through language learning, shared meals, illness, mourning, and family life, she gradually perceives Japanese gestures not as a performance, but as ethics of social respect. This evolution exemplifies how lived de-orientalization. Few scenes illuminate cultural negotiation as sharply as the bath. Clara's first bathing episode, full of towels, improvised curtains, embarrassment, and suppressed laughter, reveal the shock of embodied cultural difference. Ella Bennett's onsen panic, the grinning stranger, the frantic dash to her clothes, these moments sit between comedy and genuine vulnerability. Bathing exposes more than the body. It exposes assumptions about privacy and shame, about the gendered gaze, about where dignity resides. Humor becomes a defense and a bridge, a way to manage cultural permeability. Clara writes early of fleas, mosquitoes, and oppressive heat, and later of acceptance, and I quote, "This is acclimatization, I suppose," end of quote. Heat, bugs, customs. These are not trivial complaints, but signs of embodied cultural adjustment. Ships become metaphors for identity, leaving behind the last Western space, stepping fully into a new life. This is not sudden. It is felt in the skin, lungs, stomach, and heart. It is an emotional geography. Homesickness, discovery, discomfort, attachment, and eventually a sense of belonging. Western women in Meiji Japan were not passive spectators. They were participants in shared modernity, shaped by daily encounters, friendships, language learning, and intimate negotiations of etiquette and emotion. Clara's writings and those of her contemporaries reveal empathy emerging from contact, identity reshaped through proximity, modernity formed in domestic, bodily, and emotional space. Japanese studies as a relational, co-creative practice. Their stories remind us that cultural knowledge is not extracted, it is co-authored. Japanese studies then and now, then and now is a space where worlds meet, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes beautifully, and where understanding is made through dialogue, humility, and shared experience. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for this great presentation. I especially valued the richness of the material and the visual sources. I had a couple of questions just on areas I hope maybe you can just expand on. One is on how should we maybe conceptualize the significance of these international marriage cases. I know there's a rich literature on contemporary anthropology on international marriages in current day Japanese society, and I was curious, I guess, from a comparative perspective, what's specifically, what are the kind of dynamics, the gender dynamics and the racial dynamics that are going on in the Meiji period that are perhaps distinct from, say, contemporary? I mean, the famous examples you have are like Woman on the Verge, about you know, Western men and Japanese women, for instance. There's also obviously many famous, pretty common, good literature as well on Japanese men marrying women from Southeast Asia, things like this. So in the kind of gender and racial dynamics and those kind of relationships we see today versus the Meiji period, what's different, what's distinctive about this time period, and maybe what are some of the kind of comparative insights that can be drawn there? And I think one other question I had is in Japanese history, from the perspective of gender relations, the Meiji period is a period where, with the Meiji Civil Code in the 1890s, that really entrenches the household system, the Ie system, and really strong patriarchal control of women in the household. And so I was curious about how Western women navigated, especially this time period that you're discussing with your case study. It is this period of transition from essentially early modern ideas about gender relations in the household to the emergence of modern household, and there's debates about the role of women in society going on in Japan. And I was just curious about how these Western women interfaced with those debates, maybe, and also with their actual experience of living under the Japanese household system. And then finally, I was curious about your discussion of deorientalization and also the embodied cultural adjustment experience of these women. I was curious to see more, I guess, I wanted to hear more, I guess, direct evidence of how they actually approached Japanese culture towards the end of their time in Japan. And I guess one thing I wonder about is, you know, to what extent can you ever fully deorientalize? And I think there's hard limits to the ability of people today and then to ever fully sort of remove their pre-existing biases and things like that. So I guess today I think you give a very hopeful, I think, story that is oriented towards the current field of Japanese studies in a very productive way, which I respect. But then I guess to make you turn more negative, to not just talk about the potential of these kind of interactions, but also the limits of these kind of interactions, and what your thoughts on that. So those are my three main categories of questions. I hope that makes sense, and I really appreciated the research and the talk, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. The first question about sort of the marriages between Western women and their Japanese spouses. clearly there were less of them, and they're less written about. Many of the letters and the diaries haven't been digitalized. They are quite difficult. The photographs that I provided today were actually very difficult to source as well. And that's often because the women that were coming to Japan and marrying were often marrying quite notable men. So they became footnotes in the biographies of those men. So I actually came across these names often by accident. Reading books about Japan, I was very interested in Japan. I would find a name such as Clara Whitney. That's how I came across her. And I would start to search for what's written about her, and I wouldn't really find very much, but I would find a dusty old diary somewhere that very few people buy, and I became very interested. Why weren't those Western women's voices really heard? Or if they were heard as footnotes to their more well-known partners, husbands, spouses. So I was really interested in that. And they wrote very eloquently. They wrote letters, diaries, cooking books even, about their experiences in both Meiji Japan and post-Meiji, is also what I'm interested in. So to answer your question, the differences between the situation of being a Western woman married to a Japanese spouse in contrast to a Japanese woman, well, often they were able to bridge the world because they were seen as an other. So they weren't necessarily restricted in the same way. They were allowed a lot of freedom. The Jinrikisha story is just one of them, but they were allowed to be out and have that freedom that maybe their Japanese counterparts didn't have quite the same access to. So I was really fascinated by Clara for three reasons, really. Clara was both a missionary, she was also an educator, she was also a spouse, and she lived in Japan for 25 years. So it gave me an opportunity to see different glimpses of Japan in her lifetime. So I hope I've asked that question. The second one is about patriarchal control. And again, this was quite interesting for me. Previous to Clara, I'd studied Rita Taketsuru, who's often called the mother of Japanese whiskey. She came later on in the 1920s. And many of you would know who Rita is from the TV drama, which I've never watched, actually. But I was very interested in her life because she grew up in a very, very small town in Scotland, a very rural town, Kirkintilloch, which I went to visit, and had a very sort of post-Victorian, very strict upbringing. You know, she wasn't allowed to socialize. She was privately educated, so she didn't really interact a lot with other people. And she met a young Japanese man who was studying engineering at the university. And from the sort of letters and the diaries that she wrote, you can glimpse that she's looking for freedom. And she sees going to Japan. Of course, it was a love marriage, but she also sees it as an opportunity to be independent. So a lot of these Western women that did come over to Japan saw it actually as an opportunity for independence from Victorian society and post-Victorian Edwardian society as well. So the patriarchal control, they didn't see it in that way. They actually saw it as an opportunity for more freedom, more independence, which they did. By and large, they did get. Certainly Rita, although she was later post-Meiji, she was very influential in the establishment of Nika whiskey. The third question about deorientalization and Japanese culture, yes, I would agree that with once you've experienced that, it's very difficult to let go. If I go back to Clara's experience, the story actually ends a little bit sadly. after she's married to Umetaro, she has 6 children. So she goes back, they divorce actually, and she goes back to Pennsylvania there. And she always speaks very, very fondly of Japan, how much she loves Japan. She continues writing, and it's very important. So clearly Japan stays with her. She doesn't speak at all about her ex-husband, but maybe that's understandable. But she talks very fondly of Japan, and it remains with her. And when I read about other women as well, those that return back to their home countries often carry on that message and that belief in Japanese, culture and history and, even cooking, for example. So they continue to have that. But of course, they don't have that experience anymore, that lived experience that they had when they lived in Japan. So I hope I've answered all those questions. Thank you.
高村さん、ラミコ先生、ありがとうございました。では、ちょっとここで予定を変更いたしまして、先ほど、ディスカッサントの先生と、あとフロアとの Q&A をまとめて10分で合わせてお時間取りますというふうに申し上げたんですけれども、ちょっと予定変更をしまして、これから先ほどのパネリストの3人の方々への質問をまとめて、お時間取りたいと思います。そうですね、はい、でそうですね、時間の都合上ちょっと 2,3 人ぐらいになってしまうかなと思うんですけれども、ご質問のある方は、挙手いただければマイクをお持ちしますので、ご質問のある方いらっしゃいますでしょうか。あ、はい。
Hi, everybody. My name is James. Thank you for all of these talks. They were really interesting, and I'm excited to ask more questions. And I have a lot of questions for all of you. But I guess I was just going to start with Jerry's presentation. Thank you. It was really interesting. So I am a contemporary and modern literature student. And while I'm not that well versed in Meiji literature, like I immediately think of kind of late Meiji as being a sort of watershed moment where not necessarily actual Western transplants are playing a huge role in kind of the formation of like Japanese femininity, say, but thinking about writers like Ibsen and their translations, and thinking about how like the image of like Nora in A Doll's House in like 1911 had this profound effect on how Japanese women came to see the possibilities for like kind of the start of like the kind of Seito and like feminist movement, and like the work of like Hiratsuka Daicho and people like that. And so I wonder if you've looked at all at like, I know that's kind of like later Meiji, so I don't know if you necessarily consider that like in your purview, but like if you've looked at all at like sort of the kind of translated images of like Western women and how that kind of had a role on like Japanese women more than Western women, perhaps.
So sorry, do you mean that how post-Meiji or Meiji, post-Meiji, how Western women were viewed through sort of art and literature? Is that what you mean?
Not so much how Western women were viewed, but how, not so much just how they were viewed, but like maybe the role that women, like characters or protagonists, might have had in kind of the formation of Japanese identity to an extent.
Right.
To whatever extent that was the case.
Right. Okay. Identity. Yeah. Well, I think I do actually go up post Meiji as well. So the identity of these women particularly, I gave you the pictures there. You probably noticed actually quite a few of the women were wearing yukatas or kimonos. So they often embrace that. And they, as I mentioned in my talk, they wanted to be a bridge. I mentioned Rita, who was post-Meiji. But actually, she always lived in Japan. She never went back to Scotland. She went back once, but she wore Japanese clothes and she spoke Japanese. She never learnt to write or read, but she wore Japanese clothes, she spoke Japanese, she even adopted her nephew. So the image of Rita, and you can see quite a lot of photographs of her, are very Japanese. And those, those are seen at the time, and she sends those photos back to her mother. So she is seen as a sort of hybrid, and it's interesting how she's viewed, because she's viewed as neither Scottish or Japanese. I think that's quite interesting. And there are other pictures of other Western women who take on the sort of the clothing. There's pre-war and wartime, there's Gwen Terasaki, who's married to the diplomat. And if you have a look at her photograph, she's wearing Japanese kimono again. And the image of her, is again seen as being a sort of bridge. And I think that's quite interesting, that Western women are seen very much as a sort of hybrid. They've adopted their husband's country, and therefore it's not just through their marriage, but it's also physically as well. They're seen as adopting that look, and it's very sort of exotic to see, a Western woman in a kimono and living a very sort of normal Japanese life. It's what they did. Cooking. Apparently, Rita was a fantastic cook of Japanese cuisine. And I think occasionally she tried to make people eat haggis, but the idea of that, very much of that image of that hybrid, which I don't think you get so much of in the opposite sense. So I think people were able to see it as a much more, a very lovely picture in a way of, Japanese culture. And that's what interested me when I came across these photographs. Why aren't they seen? Why aren't people seeing those pictures, and why are they so hard to find as well? So did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
Okay.
I'd love to also, I don't want to take up the time, but I'd love to know more too about how that kind of hybrid image was sort of perceived by Japanese women, and what that meant kind of for how they viewed their own.
Yeah. Well, I think, sorry, just to finish on that one, I think I've got a grasp of what you were asking there. These Western women write diaries and they write letters back home, and they give a snapshot of their Japanese friends. I mean, most of them had mostly Japanese friends. They were quite isolated. They often lived in very rural communities. Not all of them were in Tokyo. And so they had Japanese female friends, and very good friends. There was certainly a very close bond with their friends as well. So for Rita, and again I mentioned Rita because she was here for such a long time, but when she gets to the wartime, she's quite upset because these friends start to feel uncomfortable being with her, and she says, if you, I am Japanese now. That's the way she feels. She hasn't been back to Scotland for 30 years. So I think, but that friendship is very close. Those bonds between her female, particularly Japanese friends, is very warm and very, very close. So I think that's another very interesting part of their relationships as well.
Thank you. Thanks for bearing with the convoluted question.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentations. I meant to ask two questions to Raj and also Miss Heng. Sorry to mispronounce your name. So the first question for Raj-san, Yash, is that so you told me a little bit about your project earlier. So I was wondering that when you were comparing this different folk songs, so I think you have answered this. There is you choose this Hawaii immigrant sounds which express nostalgia. So do you think your idea of nostalgia has changed after these case studies, and do this case study in this Hawaii region, they complement or challenge existing definition of nostalgia. And about the second presenter, thank you. So I was wondering that I was reminded of some contemporary Japanese authors, for instance, the female writer Ogawa Ito, and she also talked about how this traditional way of breast feeding and going back to the family to resume traditional gender roles for women is helpful. Do you think this kind of narratives in contemporary literature actually affirm these stereotypes, or actually they provide another way to think about what women have been doing throughout the decades? Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the questions. At first, see, I want to clarify one thing here, that so my research area is basically Minzoku Gaku, folklore studies. Among folklore studies, minyo to yu kotoba wa minyo is one of the major component of the folklore. While researching, when earlier I started researching on the field of Nogyo ni kansuru minyo, agricultural folk songs, and while researching I found that in my hometown there are problems of iju mondai. Hitobito wa mura kara dai tokai e ido shimasu. Sono toki mo, and since it's a comparative study, so when I started searching for Japanese side, that is there any migration thing is there related to folk songs, then I came across Hore Hore Bushi. One thing, if it is about comparison, one thing I would like to clarify here, that unlike Japanese classification of the folk songs, in my state, in India, there is not much classification. Like in case of Japan, there are songs dedicated to Taue uta, Shukhaku uta, but in my state there are not classification, academic classification as per the compared to the classification of the Japanese side. So my focus was basically Imin Mondai. Imin Mondai, Imin tachi wa chokumen shite iru mondai ni tsuite hanashita kattaんですけど、その時教授家族の絆とノスタルジアなどがありました。と in case of Bihar, there is internal migration, means people from the village move towards Daitokai, big cities. But in case of Japan, it was Kaigai Iju. The people going to another country from Japan just to work. In that case, the tone is almost same. The tone is almost same. In case, since they left their country, obviously they will remember their country and the culture they used to practice when they were in their own country, like when they were in Japan. But in case of Bihar's song, it is quite different, because most of the male member of the family used to go to Daitokai to earn money. In that case, women left alone in the hometown, they used to work in the field and various field, and while waiting for their son or husband, they used to sing these kind of song. So in that case, it's not nostalgia, it's a kazoku no kizuna in that case. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. I'm not familiar with the author you mentioned, but I am familiar with the contemporary discourse of let's go back to the natural and traditional, and it's healthier for the family. Because as my discussant said, this is also happening in the US, where I'm currently studying, and in Europe as well. And the only thing I can say about that the irony is so striking, because the natural and the traditional aren't natural, neither traditional, right? This breastfeeding as an exclusively individual experience, where only a mother would breastfeed her own child, is a very modern invention. Something that actively has to be pushed and actively has to be promoted. And if we just look at the Japanese case, well into the post-war period, we see not only wet nursing, as I spoke about, but also something called morai chichi, which is like you ask another woman to nurse your child, maybe a neighbor, maybe a friend, maybe a family member. I even have a case of a mother whose own daughter just had a child, and the mother had a new child as well. She couldn't lactate, so she asked her daughter to breastfeed her new child. So the daughter is breastfeeding her brother in 1943. So whenever I hear these discourses, and then let's return to the natural and traditional, I'm like, great, let's go back to community nursing. But that is not what the discourse is trying to push forward, right? It's like this very conservative return to individual motherhood. Women stay at home and feed your children. So I'm not dealing with the contemporary, but this is my perspective on that irony of the return to something that didn't truly exist for a very long time. So thank you for that question.
Thank you very much.
Eh, 皆様ありがとうございました。それではこれでパネルセッション2を終了させていただきます。ラージさん、ズルーさん、高村さん、赤井先生、コウ先生、ダミコ先生にもう一度拍手をお願いいたします。